Hey there, tonight we're uncovering how Pilgrims survived the harsh New World. What you're about to discover is the surprising resilience they found amidst the bitter cold and unfamiliar landscapes. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the edge of the 17th century, in a world where the air is thick with the smell of change. Or is that just the whiff of desperation? England's not exactly a jolly old land these days. The King, James I, is more interested in keeping the Church of England tidy and obedient than in letting folks like you practice your faith in peace. If you're a separatist, you're probably feeling like an unwelcome guest at a never-ending royal party. Your religious meetings are about as welcome as a fox in a henhouse. Your friends and family have been gathering in secret, whispering about a place where you might worship freely, away from the prying eyes of a king who thinks he's got a direct line to God. You've got a radical idea in your back pocket. Sail across the Atlantic to the New World, a wild place that's practically screaming opportunity if you're willing to risk, well, everything. Now, let's talk cash, because dreams don't come cheap. The cost of your one-way ticket to freedom, about £5 per passenger, which in today's money could buy you a small car. For a group of 102 souls, we're talking a small fortune. That's not pocket change. It's your life savings, your future, and perhaps your sanity wrapped up in a deal with investors who are more interested in profit than in your spiritual salvation. These backers are called the merchant adventurers. They're betting on your success, as if you're a thoroughbred at the races. To make it even more fun, you're going to squeeze your entire community onto a ship that's about as spacious as a modern-day convenience store. The Mayflower, your soon-to-be floating home, measures a mere 90 feet long by 26 feet wide. Imagine cramming into this space with 101 other passengers, plus a crew of about 30. It's not exactly the Love Boat. You're not setting sail for adventure. You're cramming yourselves into a floating sardine can with a few chickens, some goats, and the occasional rat for company. Now, while everyone's busy romanticizing this as a noble quest, you're acutely aware that you're playing a high-stakes game of survival. The idea of adventure sounds appealing when you're reading it in a book with a cozy fire crackling nearby. But when you're facing a 3,000-mile journey across the Atlantic Ocean, it's more like a drawn-out episode of Survivor, with no guarantee of a second season. Before you even hit the high seas, the logistical headaches are enough to make anyone reconsider their life choices. Supplies need to be stockpiled, because once you're out there, it's not like you can pop back to the store for a loaf of bread. You'll need hardtack, salted meat, dried beans, and barrels of beer because, let's face it, the water's not safe to drink for long. Add to that your personal belongings, which you've already pared down to the bare essentials. You're not packing for a luxury cruise. You're packing like someone who might not see home or a decent meal again. And let's not forget the paperwork. The legal documents, called patents, are your ticket to settling in the New World. Without them, you're just trespassers on land someone else already calls home. Securing these legal rights is as convoluted as a soap opera plot, with negotiations that drag on longer than a never-ending winter. But despite the grim practicality of it all, there's still something undeniably magnetic about this venture. The myths of a new beginning, the idea of building a community from scratch, the hope that maybe, just maybe, you'll find the freedom to live and worship as you choose. It's that flicker of hope, however dim, that keeps you moving forward. You're not just setting sail. You're setting dreams on a course that might change the world. In the end, the romantic narrative of brave pilgrims setting out for a new world is only part of the story. It's a tale of economic necessity, religious fervor, and a stubborn determination to find a place where you can breathe without the weight of persecution pressing down on your shoulders. As you step onto the Mayflower, you're not just crossing an ocean. You're crossing the threshold into a future that's as uncertain as it is full of possibility. As the Mayflower finally cuts through the gray, churning waters of the Atlantic, you're hit with the realization that your new life begins not on solid ground, but in the creaking belly of this wooden beast. This voyage isn't just a journey. It's a test of endurance, like running a marathon in flip-flops. For the next 66 days, your world is reduced to 90 feet of wood and rope, battered by waves that seem to have a personal vendetta against you. Now, let's get down to brass tacks. The conditions aboard are nothing short of horrendous. Think of it as a floating hostel, only without the charm or the continental breakfast. You and your fellow passengers, let's call you human cargo, are packed into this vessel alongside provisions, livestock, and a creeping sense of claustrophobia. The hold is a humid, smelly labyrinth of bodies and belongings, with about 102 passengers sharing a space meant for half that number. It's like living in a can of sardines, only you're the sardine. And then there's the seasickness. Oh, the seasickness. It's less of a passing discomfort and more of a relentless assault on your senses. The Atlantic doesn't care about your stomach's delicate constitution. It's a relentless roller coaster that doesn't stop when you beg for mercy. Barrels of beer and salted meat slosh around, alongside you and your fellow travelers, in a symphony of retching and groaning. It's a miracle anyone has the energy to dream of a new world while trying not to lose their last meal. But wait, there's more. The provisions you brought with you, which seemed ample back when you were on solid ground, start to dwindle alarmingly fast. Hardtack and beer become your staples, and when the beer runs low, you're forced to drink water that's been stewing in barrels for weeks. It's more like a watery soup of despair than anything quenching. If you ever find yourself romanticizing this journey, just remember, dehydration is not a mood. As if all that wasn't enough, navigation mishaps are the cherry on top of this disaster Sunday. The Mayflower was originally meant to land near the Hudson River, but thanks to storms and navigational errors, you end up at Cape Cod, hundreds of miles off course. Surprise. Welcome to the scenic detour of your dreams, or nightmares, depending on how much you enjoy unexpected extensions on a voyage of hardship. Now, let's talk social dynamics, because nothing says community like a group of people who basically can't stand each other. The passengers are a mixed bag. You've got the saints, the religious separatists who are all about building a godly community, and the strangers, the pragmatic souls just looking for a fresh start. It's like a dysfunctional family road trip, complete with arguments, alliances, and the occasional existential crisis. These tensions bubble up, creating a pressure cooker environment that threatens to explode. Enter the Mayflower Compact, a document born out of necessity rather than idealism. Picture this. You're anchored off the coast of an unknown land, and the only thing holding your ragtag community together is a piece of paper that says you'll all try to play nice. It's not exactly the Constitution, but it's a start, a promise to form a civil body politic and make decisions for the common good. It's a symbolic olive branch in a sea of uncertainty, a precursor to democracy in a place where survival is the only game in town. Through all this, you can't ignore the elephant in the room, the romantic myth of the Pilgrims as noble adventurers. Sure, it's nice to think of them as pioneers blazing a trail to freedom. The reality is much more complicated. They're desperate, seasick, and scared, clinging to a fragile hope that the new world will offer a better life. It's less about glory and more about grit, with survival as the ultimate prize. As the Mayflower limps into the harbor and the land comes into view, you're not just arriving at a destination. You're stepping into the unknown with nothing but a promise of community and a lot of unanswered questions. The romance of this journey might have faded, but the raw determination remains, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure even the harshest trials. The ocean behind you and the land ahead promise new challenges, and you're left wondering if this gamble will pay off, or if the Atlantic crossing was just the prelude to even greater struggles. So, you've made it to land, but don't pop the champagne just yet. That's if you had any champagne, which, spoiler alert, you don't. Welcome to Plymouth, a place that's not so much the land of milk and honey as it is the land of rocks and trees. Here you are, having crossed the Atlantic, only to be greeted by a landscape that looks like it's been designed by a particularly moody artist with a penchant for greys and browns. As you step off the Mayflower, it's November 1620, and the New England weather greets you like an icy slap to the face. The winter here isn't just cold. It's the kind of bone-chilling frost that makes you question every life choice that led up to this moment. You're not just cold, you're freezing, and it's clear that Mother Nature's not giving out any warm welcomes. The first order of business is finding shelter, because let's face it, the Mayflower isn't exactly a cozy bed and breakfast. Your initial attempts at settlement come with all the enthusiasm of a group of people who've never built anything more complicated than a shed. You start constructing shelters with the materials at hand. Wood, more wood, and if you're lucky, some thatch. And since there are no handy YouTube tutorials on building homes in the new world, you're winging it with whatever skills you've picked up from your previous lives as farmers, tradesmen, and let's be honest, desperate dreamers. While you're busy playing pioneer, let's have a chat about food, or the lack thereof. You've got a pantry that's emptier than a politician's promise. The rations brought over, already depleted from the voyage, are running dangerously low. Scavenging becomes the name of the game, and you quickly learn that foraging in this new land isn't as straightforward as it sounds. It's a bit like playing a game of culinary roulette, where the stakes are survival, and the odds are, well, not in your favor. Enter Squanto, the MVP of this grim saga. Squanto, whose full name is Tisquantum, is a member of the Paduxit tribe, and he's got survival skills that make Bear Grylls look like an amateur. After being captured and taken to Europe years earlier, Squanto returned to his homeland only to find his tribe decimated by disease. Despite all this, he decides to lend a hand to these lost newcomers. He teaches you how to plant corn, catch fish, and gather local berries, all vital skills that are the difference between seeing another spring and becoming a historical footnote. Now, let's address the narrative you've been fed over the years, the warm and fuzzy Thanksgiving story. You know the one, where Pilgrims and Native Americans come together over turkey and pumpkin pie, exchanging recipes like old friends. Here's the unvarnished truth. That first winter is catastrophic. Nearly half of your group doesn't make it to spring. By April 1621, only 52 of the original 102 passengers have survived. The mortality rate is a grim reminder that this isn't just a tale of survival. It's a story of sheer desperation. What about that famous feast? Yes, there's a meal shared with the Wampanoag in the fall of 1621, but it's less of a hallmark moment and more of a practical alliance meeting. You're not sitting around a table swapping stories. You're trying to form alliances to ensure mutual survival in a land that's as unforgiving as a Puritan sermon. The menu isn't quite the feast of legend either. Think venison, maybe some fish, and whatever else you can scrounge up. Turkey might have been on the table, sure, but the real star was survival, not stuffing. The sanitized version of Thanksgiving, complete with smiling pilgrims and benevolent Native Americans, is a myth that overshadows the harsh reality. The cooperation with Native Americans, while genuine, is born out of necessity rather than festive goodwill. You're not celebrating abundance. You're marking the fact that you're still standing, albeit shakily, amid the ruins of what was once a hopeful journey. As spring finally thaws the frozen ground, things slowly begin to improve. New settlers arrive, bringing with them more supplies and a renewed sense of hope. The settlement starts to take shape, and you realize that while the dream of a new world was oversold, the tenacity to endure is very real. You're not just clinging to survival. You're carving out a place in history, even if it's not the one you imagined while rocking on the Mayflower's deck. In the end, the Pilgrim story isn't just about religious freedom or the birth of a new nation. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to adapt, evolve, and survive in the face of unimaginable odds. And while history might try to wrap this tale in a neat, romantic bow, the reality is much messier and infinitely more compelling. You're not just surviving. You're redefining what it means to thrive in a world that's anything but welcoming. So, while the myth of the Pilgrims as noble pioneers persists, remember that their true legacy lies in the grit and determination that saw them through the darkest of times. And as for the journey, well, it's just beginning. There's a whole world of challenges ahead, and the Pilgrims are about to find out that the new world has a few more surprises up its sleeve, just as the Pilgrims start to feel their feet on solid ground, literally and metaphorically. The landscape of Plymouth begins to shift from a mere survival camp to something resembling a budding community. Think of it as a ragtag version of Sim City, circa 1621, where the players are desperately trying not to lose to the elements. First off, let's talk about the nitty-gritty of building a settlement. You're not just throwing up a few huts and calling it a day. No, the Pilgrims are tasked with creating a functioning society out of wilderness. The early days are all about trial and error, mostly error, as they figure out how to work the land. It's less about dreaming big and more about not dying in the process. Now, here's where the economy enters the picture. Forget the romantic image of pilgrims living off the land in self-sufficient bliss. The truth is, they're as dependent on trade as your average millennial is on Wi-Fi. With half the original group pushing up daisies, they soon realize they can't go it alone. Enter fur trading, a lifeline as vital as Squanto's corn-growing tips. The pilgrims engage in bartering with the local Wampanoag tribe, trading English goods for beaver pelts, which are basically the Bitcoin of the 17th century. These furs are in high demand back in England, and the pilgrims need all the economic leverage they can get. But let's not gloss over the agricultural struggle. The soil in Plymouth isn't exactly the Fertile Crescent. It's rocky and stubborn, a bit like the pilgrims themselves. Yet, through sheer grit, and with a little help from their indigenous neighbors, they start to make it work. Corn becomes the MVP, with beans and squash playing supporting roles. It's not a bountiful harvest, but it's enough to stave off starvation, which is a solid win in their playbook. Speaking of alliances, let's dive into the political chess game happening in the background. The Pilgrims' relationship with the Wampanoag is a complex one, built on mutual need rather than altruistic friendship. Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, isn't just a friendly neighbor. He's a shrewd politician who sees the Pilgrims as potential allies against rival tribes. In 1621, they sign a peace treaty that promises mutual protection. It's less of a Cumbaya moment and more of a strategic handshake, but it gives the Pilgrims a fighting chance. This treaty is crucial because, let's face it, the Pilgrims are as outnumbered as a snowflake in a bonfire. Without the Wampanoag's goodwill, they'd be easy pickings for surrounding tribes. The alliance buys them time to learn, to adapt, and to slowly transform their fragile settlement into a viable community. Now, while the legend likes to paint the Pilgrims as these rugged individualists, the reality is they're leaning heavily on external support. Their survival isn't just a testament to their own efforts, but also to the broader network of trade and alliances they weave. Ships from England bring supplies and new settlers, infusing the colony with much-needed resources and human power. It's a constant balancing act of maintaining connections across the Atlantic while building local relationships that can make or break their existence in the New World. And let's not forget the merchant adventurers, those ever-persistent investors back in England. They're expecting a return on their investment, pressuring the Pilgrims to produce goods for trade. Fur, timber, and fish are shipped back across the ocean, keeping the financiers at bay, and more importantly, ensuring the flow of supplies doesn't dry up. The narrative of self-sufficiency is a comforting myth, but the truth is, it's more about resourcefulness and networking. The Pilgrims aren't living in isolation. They are part of a complex web of economic and political relationships that are just as critical to their survival as the crops they grow. As the settlement slowly expands, the Pilgrims carve out a semblance of normalcy. They build a meeting house, which doubles as a church and a community center, because who doesn't love a multi-purpose space? It's the hub of their fledgling society, where decisions are made and sermons are delivered with puritanical fervor. Life in Plymouth isn't glamorous, but it's starting to feel less like a constant battle against the elements and more like, well, life. Meanwhile, the romance of the Pilgrim story continues to be shaped and reshaped, often at odds with the gritty truths of day-to-day existence. The image of a self-contained, noble community is a comforting story for the ages. But as with most legends, the reality is messier and far more nuanced. So, as the Pilgrims settle into their new roles as pioneers, not of untamed wilderness, but of a networked world, they're laying the groundwork for something bigger than themselves. They're not just building homes and planting crops. They're constructing the framework of a community that, despite its struggles and setbacks, is slowly finding its footing in the new world. And while the journey is far from over, with new challenges and stories on the horizon, the Pilgrims are proving that survival is as much about adaptation as it is about determination. And so, as the Pilgrims settle into this brave new world, we arrive at the tantalizing precipice of their legacy. A sprawling tale that's been told and retold until it's more embroidered in your grandma's favorite quilt. The Pilgrims didn't just plant corn and borrow beaver pelts. They sowed the seeds of a cultural narrative that, let's be honest, is as much folklore as it is fact. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find that the story of these English separatists has been polished to a shine worthy of the most zealous spin doctor. The image of the Pilgrims as the ultimate underdogs, braving the wilderness with nothing but piety and perseverance, is a narrative that has captured the American imagination like a catchy jingle. But here's the rub. History is rarely as tidy or as saintly as we'd like it to be. Let's start with the Thanksgiving myth, a cornerstone of American cultural lore. The traditional tale paints a picture of pilgrims and Native Americans breaking bread in a harmonious celebration of survival and gratitude. It's a feel-good story that's been served up like a perennial piece of pumpkin pie. The reality, however, is less of a Norman Rockwell painting and more of a complex, politically charged tableau. That 1621 feast was more a diplomatic maneuver than a heartfelt gathering of friends. It marked a tentative peace brokered out of necessity, not some prelude to years of uninterrupted mutual goodwill. The mythologizing doesn't stop there. Over time, the Pilgrims have been elevated to near-mythic status as the progenitors of American ideals like freedom and democracy. The Mayflower Compact, often hailed as a proto-constitution, was a practical document born out of necessity to maintain order among a fractious group. It's more a pragmatic pact than a philosophical declaration. But as with any good legend, the truth bends to the collective yearning for a heroic origin story. Economically, the Pilgrim story is less about self-sufficiency and more about savvy survival in a global trade network. The narrative of rugged individualism glosses over the fact that without the merchant adventurer's financial backing or the fur trade that kept their creditors at bay, Plymouth might have been just another failed colonial venture. The Pilgrim story is entangled with the economic realities of a burgeoning global economy, one that demanded alliances and adaptability far more than isolationist grit. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the overshadowing of other narratives. The Pilgrim story has often been cast in a spotlight so bright it eclipses the stories of other groups who played significant roles in the early colonial tapestry. The contributions of Native American tribes like the Wampanoag, who not only aided the Pilgrims, but were pivotal players in the early colonial dynamics, often get reduced to footnotes. Similarly, the trials and triumphs of other settlers, like the Jamestown colonists who planted their flag in Virginia 13 years before the Pilgrims set foot on Plymouth Rock, are frequently overshadowed by this New England narrative. Moreover, the Pilgrim story tends to gloss over the darker chapters of colonial history. The expansion of colonies came at a devastating cost to indigenous peoples whose lands were encroached upon, societies disrupted, and populations decimated by disease and conflict. These are the sobering realities that many versions of the Pilgrim narrative conveniently sidestep in favor of a more sanitized tale. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. While it's crucial to acknowledge these complexities, it's equally important to recognize what the Pilgrim story symbolizes: the pursuit of a new beginning, the resilience in the face of adversity, and the human spirit's capacity to endure. These are timeless themes that resonate across generations, even if the historical details get a bit blurred along the way. The Pilgrim's legacy is a tapestry of myth and reality, a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a living narrative shaped by those who tell it. Their story, with all its embellishments and omissions, has influenced American cultural identity, serving both as an aspirational model and a cautionary tale. So, as we wrap up this chapter of history, let's strive for a nuanced understanding that embraces both the allure of the legend and the depth of the reality. Recognize the Pilgrims for what they were, neither saints nor sinners, but complex individuals navigating a complex world. They were dreamers, yes, but also pragmatists, survivors, and above all, human. And in the grand scheme of things, perhaps that's the most relatable part of their legacy. The Byzantine Empire, or as some might call it, the empire that refused to quit, rose from the ashes of the Roman Empire like a particularly stubborn phoenix. You might wonder how this ancient powerhouse managed to survive when the Western Roman Empire was being picked apart like a Thanksgiving turkey. Well, the answer lies in its prime real estate and economic savvy. Situated at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the Byzantines turned their strategic location into a golden opportunity, quite literally. Let's talk about Constantinople, the empire's glittering capital. Imagine a city so strategically positioned that it could have had its own travel show on the ancient equivalent of Netflix. Resting on the Bosporus Strait, it was the perfect pit stop for traders and travelers journeying between continents. If ancient maps had Yelp reviews, Constantinople would have been rated 5 stars for location alone. This geographical advantage wasn't just about bragging rights. It played a crucial role in the empire's economic dominance. The Byzantines were the original masters of branding, and their currency, the solidus, was the gold standard, literally. Minted from the finest gold, the solidus was so reliable that it became the preferred currency for international trade. Think of it as the Bitcoin of the medieval world, only a lot less volatile and far more tangible. For over 700 years, this shiny coin was the envy of merchants from Baghdad to the backwaters of Europe, which tells you just how much clout the Byzantines wielded. But let's not pretend the Byzantines were just sitting around counting coins and basking in their wealth. They were also cultural trailblazers. Their influence spread like a viral TikTok dance, mesmerizing neighboring territories with their art, architecture, and let's be real, their ability to throw a good party. The Hagia Sophia, for instance, was such an architectural marvel that it could make even the most cynical of Instagram influencers swoon. Built in just 5 years under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, it was the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years. That's the kind of staying power that would make even the Kardashians jealous. The Byzantines were also the original social media influencers, except instead of likes and retweets, they used diplomacy and intermarriages to extend their reach. Their court was a revolving door of dignitaries and emissaries, each eager to catch a whiff of Byzantine sophistication. In fact, the Byzantine emperor could be seen as the medieval equivalent of a blue checkmark on Twitter. Everyone wanted his endorsement. Now, let's debunk a few myths. The romantic image of Byzantium as a serene, enlightened realm is about as accurate as a weather forecast from a fortune cookie. The empire was riddled with political intrigue, religious controversies, and enough backstabbing to make a Game of Thrones episode look like a friendly neighborhood block party. Emperors came and went with alarming regularity, often meeting their end in ways that would give any self-respecting assassin pause. One emperor, Justinian Roman II, even had his nose cut off in a coup. Talk about a bad day at the office. Yet, despite the chaos and carnage, the Byzantine Empire held its ground for over 1,000 years. That's right, a millennium of political maneuvering, economic strategizing, and cultural influence. While the Western Roman Empire crumbled in 476 AD, the Byzantines kept the lights on in Constantinople until 1453, when the Ottomans finally brought the curtain down. But even in its twilight years, the empire left a legacy that would shape Eastern Europe for centuries. In the end, the Byzantine Empire was more than just a footnote in history. It was a bridge, both literally and metaphorically, between worlds. Its influence stretched far beyond its borders, impacting the culture, economy, and politics of Eastern Europe in ways that are still felt today. And if that's not a lesson in resilience and adaptability, I don't know what is. Now, if you thought the Byzantine Empire's influence stopped at architecture and economics, think again. Enter the stage, Orthodox Christianity. Oh yes, folks, we're diving into the deep end of religious influence like it's a pool party at a bishop's summer retreat. If religion was a fashion trend, the Byzantines were the original influencers, pushing Orthodox Christianity across Eastern Europe with the zeal of a door-to-door salesman who's one commission away from a vacation in Mykonos. Let's get real with some specifics. Orthodox Christianity wasn't just a belief system. It was a political tool, a cultural Trojan horse wrapped in icons and incense. The Byzantines used religion to cement alliances and expand their influence without lifting a sword. Think of it as the ultimate soft power move. All the glory, none of the bloodshed. But before you start imagining a harmonious choir of Eastern European nations singing in religious unity, let's dial it back a notch. The spread of Orthodox Christianity wasn't exactly a conveyor moment. It was more like a medieval chess game, with bishops and patriarchs maneuvering like knights and rooks. One key player, Saint Cyril. This guy wasn't just a saint. He was a linguistic Leonardo, co-creating the Cyrillic alphabet with his brother Methodius. This script was like the Rosetta Stone of its day, unlocking religious texts for the Slavic peoples. Suddenly, the Bible was accessible, and the Byzantine religious message spread faster than a meme in a group chat. Here's where it gets juicy. The creation of the Cyrillic alphabet wasn't just about spreading the gospel. It was also a power play to outmaneuver the Latin-speaking Western Church. The Byzantines were essentially saying, "We see your Latin, and we raise you a whole new alphabet." This linguistic divide wasn't just about letters. It was about control. The Cyrillic alphabet helped solidify Byzantine influence over the Slavs, providing a shared cultural foundation that went beyond mere words. And if you think that sounds a bit Machiavellian, you're not wrong. But let's not get carried away by the romanticized image of Cyril and Methodius as benevolent sages spreading enlightenment. The creation of the Cyrillic alphabet was as much about politics as it was about piety. It was a strategic move to consolidate Byzantine control over the spiritual and cultural life of Eastern Europe. The brothers were more akin to cultural diplomats than simple missionaries, shaping a linguistic landscape that would outlast any empire. As the Byzantine religious influence stretched its tendrils into Eastern Europe, the romantic notion of religious unity was more myth than reality. The ecclesiastical landscape was a hotbed of power struggles and political intrigues. If you think church politics today is a tangled web, the Byzantine era was a full-on ecclesiastical WWII smackdown. Bishops and patriarchs didn't just preach, they plotted. The patriarchs of Constantinople were like the medieval versions of corporate CEOs, wielding spiritual authority with a side of iron-fisted control. And let's not forget the Great Schism of 1054, the ultimate ecclesiastical mic drop. This was when the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church decided to part ways, each taking their theological toys and going home. The schism wasn't just a religious fallout. It was the climax of centuries of political and theological tension. It was less about profound doctrinal differences and more about which patriarch got the bigger slice of the ecclesiastical pie. In the grand tapestry of history, the Byzantine push for Orthodox Christianity was a masterclass in religious and political maneuvering. It was a game of influence played over centuries, with faith as both a sincere belief and a tool of empire. The Byzantines didn't just preach. They persuaded, politicked, and occasionally strong-armed their way to spiritual dominance. So, next time you hear about the Byzantine influence on Eastern Europe, remember that it was more than just a spiritual awakening. It was a complex tapestry of faith, power, and politics, woven together with the threads of ambition and belief. The Byzantines weren't just spreading religion. They were shaping the very fabric of Eastern European identity. And if that's not a historical plot twist worthy of a binge-worthy series, I don't know what is. So, if you're picturing the Byzantine Empire as just a bunch of religious zealots waving incense, let's toss that idea out the window faster than you can say Constantinople. The Byzantines were the OG masters of realpolitik, playing the diplomatic game with the finesse of a grandmaster and the ruthlessness of a poker shark. Their political and military strategies were like a medieval version of House of Cards, only with fewer monologues and more Byzantine bling. First up, let's talk alliances, the bread and butter of Byzantine diplomacy. The empire was like that socialite who knows everyone at the party, from the king to the court jester. They brokered alliances with neighboring tribes and kingdoms like they were collecting rare Parcayman cards. Take the marriage of Anna Porphyrogenitta to Vladimir the Great of Kievan Rus in 988. This wasn't just a royal wedding, it was a strategic masterstroke. By marrying off a Byzantine princess, the empire secured the Christianization of the Rus, expanding its sphere of influence without a single arrow being fired. Who needs war when you have wedding vows? But here's where it gets juicy. These alliances weren't just about peace and harmony. They were chess moves in a game where the stakes were continental domination. The Byzantines had a knack for playing their neighbors against each other, like a medieval version of Survivor, with the added twist of actual survival at stake. They'd support one tribe against another, only to switch sides when it suited their interests. It's the kind of double dealing that would make Machiavelli proud and modern politicians take notes. Now, while alliances were the velvet glove. Greek fire was the iron fist. This notorious weapon was the Byzantine equivalent of a secret recipe, guarded as jealously as Colonel Sanders' herbs and spices. In the 7th century, when Arab fleets threatened Constantinople, Greek fire turned the tides, literally. Imagine a flamethrower on water spewing fiery death that could burn even on the sea's surface. It was the medieval version of a nuclear deterrent. Nobody wanted to face it, and those who did rarely lived to tell the tale. Greek fire was more than just a military marvel. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Opposing forces faced not just physical destruction, but the terror of an enemy wielding seemingly supernatural powers. This wasn't just about winning battles. It was about instilling fear, ensuring that even the thought of challenging the Byzantines would send shivers down the spine of any would-be invader. It's no wonder the formula was a state secret more closely guarded than the emperor's favorite wine. But while Greek fire was scorching the headlines, behind the scenes, Byzantine political strategy was weaving an intricate web. The empire was a master of divide and conquer, exploiting the rivalries of neighboring tribes like a soap opera writer on a caffeine binge. They'd prop up one leader while undermining another, ensuring that no single power grew too strong. This wasn't just about self-preservation. It was about maintaining regional dominance with all the subtlety of a chess grandmaster, orchestrating a checkmate. And speaking of chess, let's not forget the role of marriage alliances in this grand game. Byzantine princesses were dispatched across Europe like diplomatic parcels, each one a living embodiment of the empire's soft power. When Theophano married Otto Roman II of the Holy Roman Empire in 972, it wasn't just a union of two people, it was a merger of empires. Theophano brought Byzantine culture and influence to Western Europe, a Trojan horse in silk robes. These marriages were about more than just love, or even lust. They were strategic gambits, each one calculated to extend Byzantine influence like a creeping vine across a trellis. Of course, not all Byzantine marriages were made in heaven. Some were more like matches made in political purgatory. Take the infamous union of Zoe, a Byzantine empress with a penchant for poison, who went through husbands like a reality TV star goes through drama. Her political marriages were less about alliances and more about consolidating her own power, showcasing the darker side of Byzantine matrimonial politics. In essence, the Byzantines wielded alliances, marriages, and military might like a three-pronged trident, each prong sharp enough to pierce through the murky waters of medieval geopolitics. Their strategies were as varied as they were effective, a testament to their adaptability and cunning. They didn't just survive in a world of shifting alliances and constant threats. They thrived, turning potential adversaries into pawns in their own imperial game. As we continue to unravel the Byzantine story, let's not forget the sheer audacity of their strategies. They played their neighbors like a maestro conducts an orchestra, each note resonating with the sound of Byzantine influence. And while the empire may have eventually fallen, its legacy of political and military prowess echoes through history like the haunting strains of a Byzantine chant. But hold that thought, because there's more to this tale of intrigue and power, and you won't want to miss what comes next. As the Byzantine Empire expertly conducted its grand orchestration of political and military might, it was also busy composing another symphony, a bustling economic network that stretched across Eastern Europe and beyond. The empire's role in shaping commerce was akin to a maestro controlling the tempo and dynamics of a complex concerto, with trade agreements and tariffs serving as the sheet music. But before you start picturing the Byzantines as ancient tycoons lounging in opulent palaces, let's peel back the gold leaf to reveal the gritty economic reality underneath. First, let's talk about the Byzantines' role as the middleman extraordinaire. Think of them as the Amazon Prime of the medieval world, minus the two-day shipping, but with a lot more silk and spices. The empire's location was the ultimate real estate jackpot, situated perfectly to control trade routes between Europe and Asia. This wasn't just a geographical fluke, it was a strategic gold mine. The Byzantines knew how to capitalize on their prime position, turning trade into a fine art. Take the silk trade, for instance. Silk was the medieval status symbol, the luxury good that separated the wheat from the chaff, or more accurately, the nobility from the riffraff. The Byzantines didn't just import silk. They cornered the market like a Wall Street wolf with a penchant for textiles. They established trade agreements with the Sasanian Empire and later the Islamic Caliphate, ensuring a steady flow of silk that they could sell at a hefty markup to the fashion-forward elite of Europe. But it wasn't just about silken threads and high margins. The Byzantines were also savvy enough to diversify their trade portfolio. They dealt in everything from spices and precious stones to slaves and furs. If you could put a price on it, chances are the Byzantines were trading it. Yet, for all their trading prowess, this wasn't a one-way street lined with gold. Byzantium was as much a consumer as a supplier, importing grain from Egypt and the Black Sea regions to feed its population, which could swell to 500,000 at its peak. This wasn't just about feeding mouths. It was about maintaining stability and preventing the kind of bread riots that could topple emperors faster than you can say, Veni, Vidi, Vici. Now, about those tariffs. The Byzantines were masters of the toll booth, the gatekeepers who turned trade routes into revenue streams. They levied taxes on goods passing through Constantinople like a modern-day customs agency, ensuring that traders contributed to the imperial coffers. This wasn't just an economic necessity. It was a political strategy, a way to exert control over the flow of wealth and resources. If you wanted your goods to move, you paid the piper. And if you think the piper played a mellow tune, think again. These taxes could be hefty, cutting into profits, but ensuring the empire's financial stability. But let's not romanticize this as some ancient version of a tax paradise. Byzantine opulence, as alluring as it might sound, was often more smoke and mirrors than actual gold and jewels. The economy was a precarious balancing act, swaying between prosperity and crisis like a tightrope walker with a questionable sense of balance. Inflation was a constant threat, with the value of the solidus fluctuating like a yo-yo on a caffeine high. In the 11th century, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had to deal with the debasement of currency, a financial quagmire that could make even the most seasoned economist break into a cold sweat. And let's not forget the constant threat of warfare, which drained the treasury faster than you can say siege warfare. Maintaining a standing army wasn't just a line item in the budget. It was a monumental expense, one that required constant revenue streams just to keep up with the never-ending cycle of conflict and defense. The Byzantines were often caught in a fiscal tug-of-war between military needs and economic stability, a battle that was as fierce as any fought on the field. So, while the Byzantines may have dazzled with their silk and gold, the reality was often a far cry from the romantic image of endless wealth and luxury. The empire's economy was a high-wire act, a delicate dance between prosperity and peril, with the constant risk of tumbling into financial chaos. Yet, despite the challenges, the Byzantines managed to maintain their position as a key player in the medieval economic game, a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. As we dive deeper into the Byzantine economic tapestry, let's not forget the human element. The traders, merchants, and even the emperors who orchestrated this grand commercial ballet. Behind the numbers and trade agreements were real people navigating the complexities of an empire that was constantly evolving, adapting, and striving to maintain its place in a world that was always on the brink of change. And with that, we've only scratched the surface of the Byzantine economic saga. There's still more to unravel, from the intricate web of trade networks to the political machinations that underpinned this empire of commerce. So, buckle up, because the Byzantine story is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be just as thrilling as the last. As we delve further into the Byzantine saga, let's shift our gaze towards the legacy this empire left behind, a footprint so enduring it's practically imprinted on the Eastern European landscape. Now, if you're picturing crumbling ruins and dusty relics, think again. The Byzantine legacy is less about what's left standing and more about what's woven into the very fabric of modern culture, like the hidden stitches in a couture gown. Let's start with architecture, the empire's most visible heirloom. The Byzantines weren't just about building, they were about leaving a mark, and boy, did they leave one. Their architectural style was like the architectural equivalent of a blockbuster franchise. Big, bold, and impossible to ignore. Take the Hagia Sophia, that architectural rock star we've already gushed about. Built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, It was the largest cathedral in the world for nearly a millennium. The sheer scale and grandeur of this structure were enough to make even the most jaded medieval traveler stop and say, "Whoa, now that's impressive." It was a trendsetter, the original influencer of church architecture, with its massive dome and intricate mosaics inspiring countless structures across Eastern Europe. But the Byzantine architectural influence wasn't just about size. It was about style, baby. The onion dome, a hallmark of Russian architecture, can trace its roots back to Byzantine designs. Those soaring, bulbous tops weren't just for show. They were a symbol of the divine, reaching towards the heavens in a gesture that said, "Look at us. We're closer to God than you are." This architectural legacy echoed through the ages, from the cathedrals of Moscow to the churches of Kiev, each one a testament to the enduring allure of Byzantine design. And then there's the matter of legal codes. Byzantine law, the empire's less glamorous yet equally significant contribution. If architecture was the empire's public persona, law was its quiet, behind-the-scenes director, guiding the action without stealing the spotlight. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or the Code of Justinian, was compiled in the 6th century and became the bedrock of legal systems across Europe. Think of it as the original legal blockbuster, a compilation of Roman law that was as comprehensive as it was influential. It wasn't just about laying down the law. It was about creating a framework that would stand the test of time, like a legal version of a classic novel that never goes out of print. The Code of Justinian laid the groundwork for civil law traditions that continue to influence legal systems today. It was a codification that addressed everything from property rights to criminal offenses, with a clarity that would make any modern lawyer envious. Yet, for all its legal brilliance, let's not pretend it was a perfect system. Byzantine law could be as convoluted as a courtroom drama with too many plot twists, sometimes inconsistent and occasionally downright draconian. But hey, nobody's perfect, right? Now, let's talk about the cultural tapestry woven by the Byzantines, a tapestry that includes more than just grand buildings and legal tomes. This empire was a melting pot of cultures, a veritable stew of Greek, Roman, Persian, and Christian influences, simmering together to create something altogether unique. The Byzantines were the ultimate cultural curators, blending elements from different traditions and creating a rich, multifaceted identity that would resonate throughout Eastern Europe. One of the most enduring facets of this cultural legacy is, of course, Orthodox Christianity. We've already talked about how the Byzantines spread their faith like enthusiastic door-to-door evangelists, but let's not underestimate the depth of this religious influence. Orthodox Christianity wasn't just a faith, it was a cultural cornerstone, shaping everything from art and music to daily rituals and societal norms. It was a unifying force, providing a shared identity for diverse peoples across Eastern Europe. And while the schism with the Western Church may have been a theological divorce, it solidified the distinct identity of the Eastern Orthodox Church, an identity that remains vibrant to this day. But here's the thing about legacies. They're not all sunshine and rainbows. The Byzantine Empire, for all its glories, was also a place of political intrigue, religious conflict, and social upheaval. This wasn't a fairy tale kingdom where everyone lived happily ever after. It was a complex, dynamic society where power struggles were as common as church services. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was a dramatic curtain drop on a 1,000-year saga, but it wasn't the end of the Byzantine story. Far from it. The empire's influence continued to ripple across Eastern Europe, like the lingering notes of a powerful symphony. As for the romantic image of Byzantium as a bastion of enlightenment and culture, let's take that with a grain of salt. Sure, there were moments of brilliance and grandeur, but there were also times when the empire was more soap opera than historical epic. Emperors rose and fell with alarming regularity, sometimes meeting their ends in ways that would make any drama queen proud. Yet, despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, the Byzantines left a legacy that was as resilient as it was influential. In the end, the Byzantine Empire was more than just a historical footnote. It was a bridge between worlds, a conduit through which ideas, cultures, and traditions flowed like a mighty river. Its influence on Eastern Europe was profound, shaping the region's identity in ways that are still felt today. From the soaring domes of Orthodox cathedrals to the enduring principles of Byzantine law, the empire's legacy is woven into the very fabric of modern Eastern European culture. So, as we wrap up this Byzantine journey, let's not forget the lessons this empire has to offer. The Byzantines were masters of resilience, adapting to changing circumstances with a tenacity that would make even the most seasoned survivor take note. They were builders, thinkers, and strategists, crafting a legacy that transcended their own time. And if that's not a testament to the power of human ingenuity and adaptability, I don't know what is. As you drift off with these tales of Byzantine splendor and strategy echoing in your mind, remember that history is never just black and white. It's a tapestry of stories, each thread contributing to the rich, complex picture of our past. The Byzantine Empire may have fallen, but its legacy lives on, a timeless reminder of the heights that human civilization can reach. And with that, dear listener, we bid adieu to the magnificent, maddening, and utterly mesmerizing world of Byzantium. Until next time, keep your eyes on the past and your thoughts on the future, because history is always waiting to surprise us with its next chapter. In the bustling streets of 1783 Caracas, a city where the air was thick with the scent of revolution long before it had a name, a young Simon Bolivar entered the world. He was born into a family that had more money than some small countries, thanks to the vast estates and a fortune built on sugar plantations. But before you start picturing a life of luxury, unbroken by hardship, hold onto your tricorn hat. This is no fairy tale. Bolivar's early life was a roller coaster of wealth and loss, privilege and precarity. By the tender age of 9, young Simon had lost both his parents. Yes, he was an orphan before he could master long division. His father, Juan Vicente Bolivar y Pont, passed when Simon was just 3. 6 years later, his mother, Maria de la Concepción Palacios y Blanco, also left this mortal coil. It's a tragic start fit for a Dickens novel, minus the foggy London streets, and plus a lot more Spanish colonial architecture. But don't feel too sorry for him just yet. Orphaned he may have been, but penniless he was not. Simon was raised by his uncles and a series of tutors, some of whom would make a modern-day babysitter tear their hair out. One tutor, Simon Rodriguez, was a radical thinker who filled young Bolivar's head with ideas about liberty, equality, and other Enlightenment ideals that were the intellectual equivalent of lighting a match in a room full of fireworks. The Bolivars were so loaded that young Simon's education took him to Europe, where he encountered not just the grandeur of Paris and Madrid, but also the smoldering embers of the French Revolution. Picture Simon in his late teens, wide-eyed, and absorbing the chaos and promise of a society attempting to rebuild itself from the ground up. In 1804, at the age of 21, Simon was in Italy witnessing Napoleon Bonaparte crown himself emperor. If there was ever a moment to crystallize his disdain for tyranny, this was it. Napoleon was a rock-star dictator with dreams of grandeur, but to Bolivar, he represented the antithesis of the freedom he envisioned for South America. Now, one might wonder why a wealthy Venezuelan youth cared so much about political philosophy instead of, say, attending lavish parties or collecting wigs. The answer lies partly in his exposure to Europe's intellectual elite and partly in the political climate back home. The Spanish colonies were simmering with discontent, and Bolivar had no intention of letting them cool off. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back in Caracas, the social hierarchy was as rigid as a starched collar. The Spanish crown controlled the colonies with an iron grip, and the Creole elite, locally born people of European descent, like Bolivar, were itching for a change. They were tired of being treated like second-class citizens in their own homeland, and Bolivar, with his immense wealth and even bigger ambitions, was uniquely positioned to do something about it. So, what's a young man with dreams of liberation and a pocketful of Enlightenment ideas to do? Head back to Europe, of course. In 1802, at the ripe age of 19, Bolivar married Maria Teresa Rodriguez del Toro y Alesa. Their honeymoon was a whirlwind European tour. Think of it as the 19th century equivalent of backpacking through Europe, just with a lot more formal wear. Tragically, Maria Teresa died of yellow fever less than a year later, a heartbreaking blow that sent Bolivar into deep despair. He swore never to marry again, a vow he kept even as he flirted with political danger across continents. As Bolivar navigated his grief, he doubled down on his revolutionary aspirations. He returned to Europe and met with his old tutor, Simon Rodriguez, who reignited his passion for freedom and reform. If Bolivar were a character in a modern drama, this would be his training montage scene. Except instead of lifting weights, he's devouring books on Rousseau and Montesquieu. Back in Venezuela, the winds of change were picking up speed. By 1810, the Spanish king had been overthrown by Napoleon, and the colonies saw their chance to break free. Bolivar was back in Caracas, ready to roll up his sleeves and dive headfirst into the chaos. He joined the ranks of the revolutionaries, and with his family's fortune bankrolling the effort, he became one of the movement's most influential leaders. But let's not sugarcoat it. Bolivar's early attempts at revolution were anything but smooth sailing. In 1811, the first Venezuelan republic was declared, but it was about as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Internal divisions, a lack of military experience, and ongoing royalist opposition left the fledgling republic teetering on the brink of collapse. Bolivar's initial military ventures were more keystone cops than brilliant strategist, but he was nothing if not persistent. He suffered several defeats, including the infamous Admirable Campaign of 1813, which, despite its grandiose name, was a series of hit-and-miss skirmishes that ended with Bolivar retreating to the mountains. Yet, for all the setbacks, he was undeterred. In fact, his persistence was legendary. This was a guy who simply refused to take no for an answer, even when the universe seemed to be screaming it at him. As the revolution stumbled along, Bolivar made a name for himself, not only as a charismatic leader, but also as a man who knew how to make an entrance. In 1813, after a somewhat successful campaign, he was declared El Libertador by the people of Merida, a title he would carry for the rest of his life. But don't let the heroic moniker fool you. Bolivar's path to liberation was littered with as many failures as it was with triumphs. So, that's where we leave our young, ambitious Simon Bolivar for now. A man whose early life was an unpredictable blend of wealth, tragedy, and the slow burn of revolutionary zeal. He's on the cusp of a journey that will take him from the tropical jungles of South America to the pages of history books around the world. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of South America's own liberator. Now, let's pivot back to our man Simon Bolivar, standing at the precarious edge of glory and disaster. You could say he was a man caught between a rock and a hard place, or in his case, between a revolutionary dream and a very stubborn reality. Bolivar was like a maestro composing a symphony with a few too many wrong notes, but his persistence was the drumbeat that kept the whole orchestra from falling apart. Bolivar's early attempts at revolution were less Mozart and more middle school band practice. Take the so-called Admirable Campaign of 1813. Seriously, who named this thing? It sounds like a superhero movie, but played out more like a slapstick comedy. Bolivar led about 650 men on a march across the Andes, a feat of endurance, if not exactly a military masterstroke. The campaign was marked by skirmishes that were more hit and miss than shock and awe. Sure, he managed to take a few towns and inspire the locals, but let's not pretend he was transforming the continent overnight. The campaign was indeed admirable, if by admirable you mean ambitious but flawed. And yet, Bolivar's speeches were nothing short of theatrical. He could whip up a crowd like a rock star, even if his battlefield tactics sometimes went flat. His rhetoric was the stuff of legend, filled with promises of liberty and the end of tyranny. But here's the rub. While his words soared, his logistical skills were still trying to catch a flight. He was like a chef with a fantastic recipe, but missing half the ingredients. Bolivar's military ventures in Venezuela were a crash course in resilience. In 1812, the first Venezuelan republic crumbled like a house of cards in a stiff breeze, thanks to internal divisions and a lack of experience. Bolivar found himself playing both firefighter and arsonist, trying to salvage what was left of his beloved republic while inadvertently setting new fires with his ambitious plans. It was a juggling act, and he was dropping balls left and right. One of the more infamous episodes was his brief control of Caracas. After a series of daring maneuvers, Bolivar entered the city in triumph, only to be booted out when royalist forces regrouped. It was a classic case of easy come, easy go, with Bolivar learning the hard way that holding a city is a lot tougher than taking it. This pattern of win today, lose tomorrow, became a recurring theme in his early career, a testament to his tenacity, if not his strategic genius. Now, let's talk about the price of this persistence, both literal and figurative. War is expensive, folks, and Bolivar's pockets were only so deep. Financing a revolution is like trying to fill a bathtub with a thimble. By 1814, Bolivar's personal fortune was taking a nosedive faster than you could say, "Viva la Revolución." You think you've got credit card debt? Try bankrolling an entire army while juggling diplomacy and military strategy. Bolivar was learning that while ideals might be priceless, the cost of pursuing them can be staggering. Yet for all his setbacks, Bolivar's charisma was undeniable. He was the guy who walked into a room and made everyone feel like they were in on a world-changing secret. Maybe that's why people followed him, even when the odds were about as good as a snowball's chance in hell. His ability to inspire was matched by a resolve that bordered on stubbornness. This was a man who simply refused to give up, even when the universe seemed to delight in throwing him curveballs. And let's not forget the bigger picture. The social and political dynamics in Venezuela were as volatile as a shaken soda can. The Creole elite, like Bolivar, were tired of being treated like second-class citizens, while the lower classes were caught in the crossfire of changing regimes and empty promises. Bolivar was trying to unite a country that couldn't agree on what they wanted for lunch, let alone how to govern themselves. It was like herding cats, but the cats were armed and had strong opinions about taxation without representation. So, here's the takeaway. Bolivar's early campaigns were a masterclass in persistence and the messy reality of revolution. He wasn't just fighting battles, he was battling the very idea of what it meant to be free. His story is one of romantic ideals clashing with the gritty reality of nation building. And while the admirable campaign might not have been the grand triumph its name suggests, it laid the groundwork for Bolivar's relentless pursuit of liberation. But don't think for a second that Bolivar's tale ends here. The man was just getting started, and the best, or worst, depending on your perspective, was yet to come. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the saga of South America's great liberator, a man whose dreams were as vast as the continent he sought to free. So, Bolivar was just getting warmed up. Think of him as the Rocky Balboa of revolution, always ready for another round. And this time, the Andes were his training ground. Now, if you've ever looked at a mountain and thought, "I'd rather not," you and Bolivar have something in common. But unlike most of us, Bolivar didn't have the luxury of saying, "I'll just take the scenic route." In 1819, he decided to lead his troops over the Andes, a move that was part genius, part madman, and entirely necessary. Let's put this in perspective. The Andes aren't your run-of-the-mill hills. We're talking about mountain ranges that laugh in the face of altimeters, some peaks reaching over 22,000 feet. Crossing them wasn't a mere Sunday hike. It was more like a death-defying feat that even modern military strategists would call ambitious, with a raised eyebrow. But Bolivar was armed with sheer stubbornness and a knack for logistical gymnastics that could rival a circus performer. The journey was brutal. Imagine frostbite, hypoxia, and the kind of exhaustion that makes you question every life choice that led to this point. Bolivar's army, consisting of around 500 men, faced these challenges head-on. The harsh conditions claimed the lives of hundreds, but this was Bolivar's proving ground, a testament to his belief that freedom wasn't just worth fighting for, it was worth suffering for. And suffer they did, but the payoff was monumental. Emerging from the mountains, Bolivar and his ragged band of survivors entered New Granada, modern-day Colombia, with a surprise factor that could only be compared to showing up at a party in a guerrilla suit. The royalists were caught off guard, expecting Bolivar to take the more traditional route, because who in their right mind would traverse the Andes? But this was Bolivar, a man who was anything but predictable. This audacious journey set the stage for the Battle of Boudica on August 7, 1819. Now, battles aren't usually won by surprise alone, but Bolivar had an ace up his sleeve: intelligence and timing, with the element of surprise firmly on his side and strategic acumen that belied his earlier blunders. Bolivar orchestrated a victory that was nothing short of legendary. His troops, buoyed by their recent survival of the Andes, fought with a tenacity that was as sharp as their bayonets. The numbers speak for themselves. Bolivar's forces, though slightly outnumbered, were fighting for more than just land or a political statement. They were fighting for the soul of a continent. In a decisive move, Bolivar's men captured around 800 royalist troops and sent their commander, José María Barrero, packing. The victory wasn't just a morale booster, it was a game changer. With the win at Boudica, Bolivar's reputation soared higher than the Andes. He wasn't just a military leader, he was becoming a legend in his own time. His ability to turn setbacks into stepping stones was nothing short of inspiring, and his knack for public relations was a masterclass in spin before spin doctors were a thing. Bolivar's knack for storytelling turned losses into noble struggles and victories into epic tales that would echo through history. And let's talk about PR, because Bolivar was a maestro at this game. He wasn't just fighting on the battlefield. He was waging a campaign for hearts and minds. Bolivar knew the power of a good narrative. He framed his setbacks as noble sacrifices for the greater good, a tactic that resonated with both his followers and a populace hungry for heroes. His speeches were the stuff of legend, filled with promises of liberty that were as intoxicating as they were idealistic. Bolivar's victory at Boudica was more than a military success. It was a turning point in the Colombian campaign and a significant blow to Spanish colonial rule. It opened the path to Bogotá, the capital, which fell to Bolivar without a fight just days later. This victory set off a domino effect, with New Granada joining forces with Venezuela, paving the way for the creation of Gran Colombia. Bolivar, now truly El Libertador, was riding high on a wave of revolutionary fervor. But let's not romanticize this too much. The reality was that the newly liberated territories were not all sunshine and rainbows. The economic state was precarious, and the political landscape was about as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. The Creole elite, who had supported the revolution, now found themselves in a balancing act between maintaining their newfound power and addressing the demands of the lower classes who had borne the brunt of the war. Bolivar, ever the idealist, believed in a united South America, a vision that was as ambitious as it was fraught with challenges. His vision for Gran Colombia was a bold experiment in nation-building, an attempt to create a federation of states that would stand as a bulwark against European colonialism. But the reality was a complex web of regional rivalries, economic disparities, and political intrigues that made governance a Herculean task. Despite these challenges, Bolivar's charisma and determination continued to win him allies and admirers. He was a man who could inspire loyalty even in the most dire circumstances, a leader whose vision of a free and united South America was both a guiding star and a source of endless frustration. His ability to navigate the treacherous waters of politics and war with a blend of idealism and pragmatism was nothing short of remarkable. So there you have it. Bolivar's rise to El Libertador wasn't just about military victories. It was about mastering the art of the impossible and turning dreams into reality, even if that reality was complicated, messy, and far from perfect. As Bolivar stood on the brink of his greatest challenges yet, one thing was clear. He was a man who wouldn't rest until his vision for a liberated South America was realized. But the road ahead was anything but smooth, and Bolivar's journey was far from over. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the saga of this remarkable figure, a man whose legacy would shape the continent for generations to come. As Bolivar stood on the brink of his greatest challenges, the ink barely dry on the creation of Gran Colombia, he must have felt like he was trying to turn a rock band into a symphony orchestra. This was no easy feat. His new nation was a patchwork quilt of regions stitched together with the threads of revolution, but each patch had its own distinct color and texture. Gran Colombia was a grand experiment, encompassing what we now know as Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. The idea was to create a single, cohesive entity out of diverse regions that had as much in common as a cat and a cucumber. The year was 1819, and the freshly minted nation was a behemoth, sprawling over a vast territory of nearly 1.5 million square kilometers. If you're thinking that's about the size of modern-day Peru, you're spot on. the scale of Bolivar's ambition was matched only by the enormity of the challenges he faced. Governing this expanse was like trying to run a marathon with your shoelaces tied together. The infrastructure was rudimentary at best, with roads more akin to goat paths and communications slower than a dial-up modem in a thunderstorm. Enter stage left, regional rivalries. You see, each part of Gran Colombia had its own local elite, each with its own vision of what independence should look like, none of which involved taking orders from distant Bogotá. Think of these regional leaders as rival band members, each convinced that their solo was the one that would catapult them to stardom. Bolivar, as the band's frontman, had to juggle these egos while trying to keep the peace, all the while dealing with a populace that was as diverse as their opinions. But Bolivar's problems didn't stop at managing egos. The new nation was financially wobbly, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. War had drained the coffers faster than you can say, fiscal crisis, leaving Gran Colombia with a debt that would make modern-day politicians break out in a cold sweat. The economic backbone, primarily agriculture, was in shambles, with plantations destroyed and labor shortages aplenty. The Creole elite, who had been the backbone of the revolution, were now faced with the reality that their hard-won independence came with the price tag of nation building, and it wasn't cheap. Bolivar's vision was one of unity, but the reality was a cacophony of discontent. The people of Gran Colombia were a tapestry of ethnicities and cultures, each thread pulling in its own direction. The indigenous populations, Afro-descendants, and mestizos had their own histories and grievances, many of which were ignored or dismissed by the ruling Creoles. It was a bit like trying to conduct an orchestra where each section was playing a different symphony. Amidst this chaos, Bolivar attempted to lay down the law, literally, by drafting a constitution for the new nation. Picture it, a room full of idealists and pragmatists, each with their own ideas about governance, trying to hammer out a document that would satisfy everyone. The result was a constitutional framework that was as complex as the problems it sought to solve. Bolivar envisioned a strong central government, akin to a benevolent dictatorship, which would guide the nation through its infancy. But to many, this sounded suspiciously like the monarchy they had just overthrown. Despite the lofty ideals, the cracks in Bolivar's vision began to show. The political landscape was as treacherous as quicksand, with factions forming and dissolving faster than alliances on a reality TV show. Regional leaders were loath to cede power to a central authority, and the concept of Gran Colombia as a singular entity was beginning to unravel. It was like trying to glue together a vase that had already shattered into 1,000 pieces. Bolivar, ever the optimist, saw himself as the glue that would hold Gran Colombia together, but the reality was more like trying to patch the Titanic with duct tape. His dreams of a united South America were slipping through his fingers, and the more he tried to tighten his grip, the more resistance he faced. It was a classic case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. In 1826, the cracks widened into chasms. Bolivar called for a grand congress in Panama, a last-ditch effort to promote unity among the newly independent nations of Latin America. The idea was to create a federation of states, a sort of United Nations of the Americas, with Gran Colombia as its cornerstone. But like any meeting of high hopes and low trust, it quickly devolved into a showcase of conflicting agendas and mutual suspicion. The Congress was a diplomatic quagmire, achieving little more than a few polite handshakes and a lot of empty promises. While Bolivar was trying to play diplomat, back home things were heating up. Venezuela, always the rebellious sibling in the Gran Colombia family, was growing restless. Regional leaders like José Antonio Paz began to chafe under the centralized rule, and whispers of secession grew louder. Paz, a war hero in his own right, had the charisma and the clout to rally support for a breakaway movement, and he wasn't shy about using it. Bolivar, caught between a rock and a hard place, attempted to mediate, but his efforts were akin to trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. The political infighting was reaching a fever pitch, and Bolivar's once unassailable authority was being questioned. His vision of a united South America was beginning to look more like a pipe dream than a realistic goal. The writing was on the wall, and Bolivar knew it. In a desperate attempt to hold things together, Bolivar proposed amending the Constitution to create a stronger executive power, essentially making himself president for life. It was a move that would have made Napoleon proud, but it was also a step too far for many of his supporters. The irony was not lost on those who remembered that Bolivar had once fought against tyranny, only to find himself accused of becoming the very thing he despised. By 1828, Bolivar was a man under siege. An assassination attempt that year left him physically unharmed but politically wounded. It was a wake-up call that even his closest allies could turn against him. The attempt on his life was a stark reminder that the dream of Gran Colombia was becoming a nightmare of political chaos and personal danger. As Bolivar grappled with the harsh realities of governance, he must have felt the weight of his own ambitions pressing down on him. The dream of a united South America was slipping away, and with it, his legacy as El Libertador was being rewritten. He was a man caught between the ideals of revolution and the gritty realities of nation building, a leader whose vision was both his greatest strength and his Achilles heel. The story of Gran Colombia is a reminder that even the most charismatic leaders can be undone by the complexities of human nature and the harsh realities of politics. Bolivar's dream was grand, but the cracks were all too real, revealing the limits of even the most visionary leader. As Gran Colombia teetered on the brink of collapse, Bolivar faced the daunting task of salvaging what he could from the wreckage of his dreams. And so, with the fate of his beloved Gran Colombia hanging in the balance, Bolivar prepared to face his greatest challenges yet. The road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but one thing was clear. The story of Simon Bolivar, South America's liberator, was far from over. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the remarkable journey of a man whose vision changed the course of history, one battle at a time. As Bolivar approached the twilight of his tumultuous career, the dream of Gran Colombia was splintering like a poorly glued vase. His grand vision of a united South America was unraveling faster than a ball of yarn in a room full of kittens. By the late 1820, the political landscape was more toxic than a social media feud, and Bolivar's health was deteriorating as rapidly as his political support. The man who had once commanded armies and inspired nations now faced a different kind of battle, a personal one against illness and political infighting. Physically, Bolivar was a shadow of his former self. Tuberculosis, the 19th century's version of an unwelcome houseguest, had taken up residence in his body, sapping his strength and turning his legendary resilience into a daily struggle. Imagine trying to juggle flaming torches while dealing with a persistent cough and a fever that left you more bedridden than battlefield ready. Yet despite his declining health, Bolivar refused to step away from the political arena, clinging to his ideals even as they crumbled around him. Gran Colombia, the crown jewel of Bolivar's achievements, was falling apart at the seams. Regional leaders, each with their own fiefdom-like ambitions, were pulling in different directions, treating the central government like a pesky mosquito rather than the unifying force Bolivar had envisioned. José Antonio Paz, the charismatic Venezuelan caudillo, was leading the charge for independence from Gran Colombia, and he wasn't alone. Like a game of political Jenga, each move threatened to topple Bolivar's carefully constructed tower. By 1830, the writing was on the wall, and it was written in bold, capital letters. Gran Colombia was finished. Bolivar, ever the idealist, had hoped to retire quietly to Europe or Jamaica, but the reality was more akin to being shown the door with a polite but firm shove. In April of that year, he resigned from the presidency, a decision that was more a necessity than a choice. The political infighting had reached a fever pitch, and Bolivar found himself increasingly isolated, his vision of unity reduced to a footnote in the annals of history. As if political turmoil wasn't enough, Bolivar's personal life was a study in tragedy. His health continued to decline, and the once vibrant liberator was now a frail figure, retreating to the outskirts of Santa Marta in Colombia to live out his final days. The mansion where he took refuge, Quinta de San Pedro Alejandrino, was a far cry from the battlefields and capitals where he had once thrived. There, on December 17, 1830, at the age of 47, Simon Bolivar succumbed to tuberculosis, a disease that had claimed more lives than any war he had ever fought. But hold on a second before you reach for the tissues. Bolivar's death wasn't just the end of a life. It was the beginning of a legacy. The man who had once been the embodiment of South America's revolutionary spirit was now a martyr for the cause, a symbol of both the triumphs and tragedies of independence. His dreams of a united South America may have died with him, but his influence lingered like a stubborn ghost. The legacy of Simon Bolivar is a tapestry woven from both romanticized heroism and the harsh threads of reality. On one hand, he's the quintessential liberator, a figure whose charisma and vision inspired millions. His military campaigns, though fraught with setbacks, were undeniably pivotal in reshaping the political landscape of an entire continent. Bolivar was a man who dared to dream big, and for a while, it seemed like he could bend history to his will. Yet, on the flip side, Bolivar was a flawed human being. His vision, while grand, was perhaps too ambitious for the fragmented reality of post-colonial South America. The political and social complexities of the newly independent states proved too great for one man to govern, even one as determined as Bolivar. His tendency towards authoritarianism, his inability to compromise when it mattered most, and his failure to address the deep-seated issues of class and race in his newly liberated territories all contributed to the dissolution of his dream. Bolivar's story is a reminder that even the greatest leaders are bound by the limits of their time and place. The romantic ideal of a united South America was as enticing as it was impractical, a testament to the enduring allure of visionary leadership. Yet, the harsh reality of nation-building demanded more than charisma and ideals. It required the kind of political acumen that Bolivar, despite his many talents, struggled to muster. Today, Simon Bolivar's name is etched across the continent in the form of statues, city names, and even an entire country, Bolivia, a testament to his enduring impact. His life and legacy are celebrated each year on July 24, his birthday, when many Latin American countries remember him as a founding father of independence. But as with all legends, the myth of Bolivar is a double-edged sword, one that cuts through both the romanticized narrative of a liberator and the complex reality of a man who was as fallible as the rest of us. In the end, Simon Bolivar's story is one of triumph and tragedy, a narrative that encapsulates the messy, often contradictory nature of history itself. He was a man who dared to dream of a South America united in freedom, and though his dream faltered, his spirit endures. Bolivar was both a product of his time and ahead of it, a figure whose impact is as undeniable as it is complicated. And so, as we close this chapter on Simon Bolivar, let's remember him not just as a liberator, but as a complex, flawed human being whose life's work was an audacious attempt to reshape the world. His legacy teaches us that while dreams may falter, they can still inspire generations to come. Bolivar's story is a testament to the power of vision, the limits of ambition, and the enduring allure of a dream worth fighting for. In the dusty womb of ancient Egypt, around 3200 BCE, something remarkable began scribbling its way into existence: hieroglyphs. Now, if you're picturing a bunch of Egyptians lounging by the Nile, casually doodling on papyrus like it was the world's first art class, you're not entirely wrong. But these weren't just your average stick figures. These early glyphs were more like the first version of ancient emoji, small, punchy, and packed with meaning. Let's set the scene. Egypt, a sprawling civilization along the Nile, was bustling with trade and a burgeoning bureaucracy that needed more than just verbal agreements and handshakes to keep things rolling. Picture a world where trade wasn't just about haggling over a few goats. We're talking about massive exchanges involving grain, gold, and the ancient world's equivalent of a luxury item, linen. With such high stakes, Egyptians needed a way to keep track of who owed what, to whom, and when. Enter the hieroglyphs. These little symbols started as simple pictograms, a basic visual shorthand. Think of it as the first Instagram story, visual, brief, and telling a story in a flash. But here's the kicker. These hieroglyphs weren't just about pretty pictures. They were a response to real-world pressures. As trade routes expanded and the economy grew, the need for record-keeping skyrocketed. You can almost hear the ancient scribe muttering to himself as he figured out how to represent 10 bushels of grain without drawing 10 individual stalks. The evolution from simple pictograms to a complex writing system wasn't just some leisurely art project. It was driven by necessity. The Egyptians were masters of efficiency, and they knew that a more sophisticated system could streamline record-keeping. We're talking about a world where the pharaoh needed to keep tabs on the flow of goods and the coffers of the state. Imagine the chaos if the tax collector showed up with just a vague idea of what you owed. I think it was like 5 goats and a basket of fish. Yeah, no thanks. Hieroglyphs turned out to be the Swiss Army knife of ancient communication. They weren't just for accounting. They were versatile enough to carve up the sacred and the mundane alike. Religious texts, royal decrees, and even love poems. Yes, the Egyptians were romantics at heart, too, got the hieroglyphic treatment. This was a system that could handle the pharaoh's commands as well as the humble scribe's sharping list. But let's not romanticize it too much. Learning to read and write hieroglyphs was no walk in the park. You didn't just pick it up over a cup of coffee. Becoming a scribe required years of training, and these elite few were the gatekeepers of knowledge and administration. In a society where most people were illiterate, scribes wielded a kind of soft power, one that was as essential to the functioning of the state as the soldiers who guarded its borders. The social dynamics at play here are fascinating. Literacy wasn't just about personal enrichment, it was a strategic necessity. As Egypt's economy and trade networks expanded, so did the complexity of its social structure. Hieroglyphs were the glue holding it all together, ensuring that everything from temple offerings to diplomatic correspondence ran smoothly. Of course, every great story has its myths, and hieroglyphs are no exception. Fast forward a few thousand years, and you'll find romantic tales of hieroglyphs as some kind of magical, sacred script. The truth is, while they were indeed used in religious context, they were also the workhorse of everyday Egyptian life. It's a bit like finding out that Shakespeare also wrote grocery lists. Yes, there's beauty and art, but there's also a fair bit of mundane practicality involved. In essence, the development of Egyptian hieroglyphs was a story of innovation born out of necessity. It was driven by the need to manage an increasingly complex society, where economics, politics, and social structures were intertwined in a dance that was both intricate and vital. These ancient symbols were not just marks on papyrus. They were the very foundation upon which a civilization was built, reflecting both the grandeur and the gritty reality of life along the Nile. But let's not turn this into a neat little fairy tale where hieroglyphs merely fluttered around like butterflies on a papyrus scroll. They were more like the Swiss Army knife of communication, versatile and essential. The Egyptians wielded them with precision, whether they were chiseling divine narratives onto temple walls or jotting down the daily grocery list. Yes, even in the land of pyramids and pharaohs, someone had to remember to pick up the olives. Now, you might wonder, how did these ancient scribes manage to scribble so much without the modern convenience of a ballpoint pen? Well, the Egyptians had their own toolkit. The quintessential scribe was armed with a reed pen, which was basically the ancient equivalent of a fountain pen. These reeds were cut from the Nile's banks and shaped into a nib, making them the perfect instrument for painting those intricate symbols onto a variety of surfaces. And for ink, they concocted a blend of soot or ochre mixed with water. It sounds almost artisanal, doesn't it? A sort of ancient Etsy craft project, minus the online store. But let's be real, this was no leisurely hobby. Being a scribe was serious business. They wrote on papyrus, a plant-based paper that was sturdy enough to hold the weight of their civilization's bureaucracy. Papyrus was to ancient Egypt what spreadsheets are to modern accountants. It kept everything in order, from tax records to love letters. Fun fact. The word paper actually derives from papyrus, showing the staying power of Egyptian innovation. And if you think your office job is tedious, imagine the sheer volume of hieroglyphic documentation a scribe had to produce without Control plus Z to fix mistakes. The role of a scribe was a stable gig, too. In an era when the concept of job security was mostly a myth, scribes enjoyed a certain level of protection. They were the custodians of Egypt's bureaucratic memory, and losing one was akin to losing a living hard drive. After all, there were no paper shredders back then. The only way to erase mistakes was to physically scrape them off the papyrus, a process as tedious as it sounds. No wonder scribes were valued. They literally controlled the narrative. And speaking of narratives, let's talk about the grand storytelling. Egyptian scribes didn't just deal in numbers and lists. They spun the tales of gods and their celestial soap operas. You had Ra, the sun god, battling daily against the chaos serpent Apep, an epic that wouldn't be out of place in a Marvel film today. Imagine the drama of these divine chronicles, all meticulously preserved in hieroglyphs. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were integral to the religious and cultural fabric of Egypt. They explained the universe, justified the rule of the pharaohs, and reinforced social norms, all in the most poetic of terms. But here's the kicker. While hieroglyphs were used to capture these grand tales, they were also the workhorses of the day-to-day grind. From tallying grain harvests to recording legal contracts, hieroglyphs were the backbone of Egypt's economy. This duality is what made them so unique. They could capture the sublime and the mundane with equal flair. It's like having Shakespeare pen both Hamlet and your to-do list. Now, let's debunk a few myths while we're at it. There's this romantic notion that hieroglyphs were some sort of magical, sacred language, accessible only to priests and the elite. True, they were used in religious contexts, but they were also as commonplace as a receipt. They were functional, not just mystical. Imagine if today's legal documents were written in the same script used for religious texts. Now that would be a twist. And let's not forget the economic implications. The production of papyrus and the training of scribes were industries in their own right. A skilled scribe was worth his weight in gold, or at least in grain, which was the real currency of the time. Their education was rigorous, often starting in childhood and taking several years to complete. But once you made it, you were set for life. A veritable rock star of the ancient world, minus the paparazzi. In fact, the social and political clout of scribes was immense. They wielded a kind of soft power, a gentle but firm grip on the throats of Egypt's administrative system. Without them, the wheels of bureaucracy would grind to a halt. Their work was the glue that held the sprawling Egyptian civilization together, from the lowest peasant to the highest pharaoh. They were the quiet, unassuming heroes of ancient Egypt's narrative. So there you have it, the nitty-gritty of hieroglyphs in everyday life. They were as versatile as they were essential, serving as both the record-keepers of mundane transactions and the storytellers of divine epics. In an ancient world teetering on the edge of chaos and order, hieroglyphs were the unsung champions, balancing the scales with elegant strokes of ink and reed. As we delve deeper into the story, remember that these symbols were more than just letters. They were the voice of a civilization, echoing through the corridors of history. And speaking of civilization's voice, let's dive into one of the juiciest parts of our hieroglyphic tale, the myths that surround these symbols. You see, hieroglyphs have been painted with a mystical brush for centuries, often seen as magical keys to the universe. In reality, they were more like the ancient world's version of Microsoft Excel, indispensable but not exactly enchanting. Now, the notion of hieroglyphs as magical isn't entirely off the mark, but it's been blown way out of proportion. Sure, they were used in religious contexts. Temples and tombs were etched with these symbols, partly because they were believed to help guide the soul in the afterlife. But let's not kid ourselves. They were also the workhorses of bureaucracy in daily life, recording everything from tax dues to grain tallies. It's like saying your modern tax return is a sacred artifact. Practical, yes. Mystical, not so much. Fast forward to the late 18th century, when Napoleon's army stumbled upon the Rosetta Stone in 1799 during their Egyptian campaign. This slab of granodiorite was the ancient world's equivalent of a trilingual dictionary. It featured the same text in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. This find was akin to discovering the ancient Rosetta Stone of, well, Rosetta Stones. It was a colossal breakthrough, but let's be honest, it was more of a lucky accident than intentional archaeological quest. Sometimes history just throws you a bone. The Rosetta Stone became the Rosetta Stone of breaking the hieroglyphic code. Picture it as the cipher key in an epic linguistic treasure hunt. The Greeks, bless their alphabetic hearts, provided the comparative text that eventually unlocked the secrets of hieroglyphs. But this wasn't a one-man show. It took a cast of scholarly characters to crack the code. Enter Jean-Francois Champollion, the rock star of Egyptology. By the time he was just 16, Champollion had already mastered several languages, making him the Hermione Granger of linguistics. He wasn't just deciphering hieroglyphs for giggles. This was a full-blown obsession. Champollion was so engrossed in his work that he famously exclaimed, "G tines Elafer," translation, "I've got it," before collapsing from sheer excitement. Talk about dedication. Champalien's breakthrough came in the 1820s when he realized that hieroglyphs weren't just symbolic, but also phonetic. This was the linguistic equivalent of discovering that the Earth wasn't flat. Suddenly, those 700-plus symbols started to make a lot more sense. They were not just pictorial representations, but part of a complex system that combined ideograms, phonograms, and determinatives. In short, hieroglyphs were like an ancient version of Scrabble, where each symbol could serve multiple purposes. But let's not sugarcoat it. Deciphering over 700 symbols wasn't a walk in the park. Imagine trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box. That's the kind of Herculean task Champalien faced. The allure was undeniable, though. Unlocking hieroglyphs was like holding the keys to an ancient civilization's diary, complete with all its grand tales and mundane chronicles. Champalien wasn't alone in his quest, though he often gets the lion's share of the credit. Thomas Young, an English polymath, also played a significant role. Young was the first to propose that some hieroglyphs represented sounds. He laid much of the groundwork that Champalien later built upon. In the world of Egyptology, Young is like the bassist in a rock band, crucial but often overshadowed by the lead guitarist. Now, why were these scholars so obsessed with cracking the hieroglyphic code? Beyond the intellectual challenge, there was an economic and political allure. Egypt was a land of immense historical wealth, and understanding its language was akin to unlocking a vault of ancient knowledge and treasure. The decipherment held the promise of revealing new insights into Egypt's past, potentially rewriting history textbooks and reshaping our understanding of the ancient world. Yet, behind this romantic quest lay the harsh realities of the 19th century's scholarly rivalries. The race to decipher hieroglyphs was as much about personal glory as it was about academic achievement. Champalien and Young, despite their contributions, were embroiled in a bitter intellectual rivalry. It's a reminder that even when it comes to ancient symbols, human nature hasn't changed much. Ego often drives us as much as enlightenment. So, while the Rosetta Stone is often romanticized as a magical artifact, the reality is it was a stroke of luck and an embodiment of scholarly tenacity. Its significance lies in the window it opened to the world of ancient Egypt, a world that was as much about scribes tallying grain as it was about pharaohs and gods. The allure of hieroglyphs is undeniable, but let's not forget that their decipherment was a triumph of human curiosity, perseverance, and yes, a touch of rivalry. As we delve deeper into the story of hieroglyphs, remember that these symbols are more than just ancient scribbles on stone. They are the echoes of a civilization that balanced the grand with the granular, the divine with the domestic. They remind us that history's stories are often locked, waiting for someone with the right key, or in this case, the right stone, to unlock them. And with hieroglyphs, that key was a mix of linguistic brilliance, a healthy dose of obsession, and a little bit of luck. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the enigma of these ancient symbols and the stories they hold. And speaking of unlocking ancient narratives, let's dive into the ripple effect of hieroglyphs across Egyptian culture and beyond. These symbols weren't just linguistic playthings. They were the cultural currency that shaped art, architecture, and even the way we view ancient Egypt today. If you've ever marveled at a Hollywood blockbuster featuring a mummy or a mystical tomb, you're already a victim of hieroglyphic allure. First, let's talk art and architecture. Hieroglyphs weren't content to be confined to papyrus scrolls. No, they strutted their stuff across temple walls, obelisks, and tombs like the ancient world's graffiti. Except with divine permission, pharaohs and priests orchestrated grand narratives in stone, ensuring their legacies were literally set in stone. These inscriptions were as much about storytelling as they were about status. If your name was chiseled alongside the gods, you weren't just living in the moment. You were securing your spot in the eternal afterparty. Take the Temple of Karnak, for instance. Stretching over 200 acres, it was like the Las Vegas of its day. A sprawling complex bedazzled with hieroglyphs that chronicled everything from mundane offerings to epic battles. The sheer scale and detail were awe-inspiring, a testament to the power of hieroglyphs to convey both the grandeur of Egyptian civilization and the vanity of its rulers. But let's not get too starry-eyed. While these hieroglyphs were indeed a marvel, they also served a more pragmatic purpose: propaganda. Pharaohs used them to legitimize their reigns, often embellishing tales of victories and divine favor. It was like ancient spin doctoring, with hieroglyphs as the press release. So, while they dazzled the public, they also kept them in line, reinforcing hierarchies and social order. If you thought your social media feed was curated, imagine an entire civilization doing it, without the internet. Now, fast forward to modern times, where hieroglyphs have morphed into the quintessential symbol of all things ancient and mysterious. Thanks to a few well-placed Hollywood films and a certain Brendan Fraser franchise, hieroglyphs are often portrayed as magical symbols capable of raising the dead or unlocking hidden treasures. The reality: these symbols were more like the ancient world's equivalent of filing cabinets. Essential, yes, but not exactly spellbinding. Let's debunk some myths while we're at it. The notion that hieroglyphs are the mystical key to ancient secrets is more fiction than fact. Sure, they were used in religious contexts and adorned sacred spaces, but they were also the ancient version of a legal document. Imagine if your tax forms were etched in gold and plastered on your front door. Glamorous, right, but not exactly magical. The decline of hieroglyphs tells another fascinating chapter in this story. As Egypt evolved, so did its writing needs. Enter Demotic, the script that took hieroglyphs down a notch. By the time of Cleopatra, 69-30 BCE, Demotic was the Gotha for everyday documents, while hieroglyphs were reserved for religious and monumental purposes. This transition wasn't just about streamlined writing. It reflected societal shifts. Egypt was becoming more cosmopolitan, influenced by Greek and Roman cultures, and needed a script that matched its changing identity. Demotic was the Twitter to hieroglyphs epic saga, a more concise, user-friendly script that catered to the fast-paced world of trade and administration. It was the script of the common people, democratizing literacy and making record-keeping accessible beyond the elite scribble class. In essence, Demotic was the language of practicality, while hieroglyphs remained the language of immortality. And what about Coptic, the script that finally nudged hieroglyphs off the stage? By the 4th century CE, as Christianity spread across Egypt, Coptic, a script based on Greek with some Demotic characters, took over religious and secular texts. It was the final nail in the coffin for hieroglyphs, marking the end of an era. Yet, in their decline, hieroglyphs left an indelible mark on history and culture, symbolizing both the zenith of Egyptian civilization and its eventual integration into a broader Mediterranean world. Why does all this matter today? Well, hieroglyphs are more than just ancient scribbles. They're a testament to the power of language to shape societies and the narratives they tell about themselves. They remind us that every great civilization has its own Rosetta Stone waiting to be deciphered. A story of innovation, adaptation, and sometimes obsolescence. So, as we wrap up this leg of our hieroglyphic journey, remember that these symbols are more than just ancient eye candy. They're the echoes of a civilization's dreams, ambitions, and everyday realities. They tell us that while the medium may change, the need to communicate, to record, and to remember remains as eternal as the stone they were carved on. And as we continue to explore their legacy, let's keep in mind that history's greatest stories are often written between the lines, or in this case, between the glyphs. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where we'll delve deeper into how these ancient symbols continue to influence our world today, from pop culture to modern linguistics. So, here we are, standing at the crossroads of history and modernity, where ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs meet today's pop culture, like a celebrity cameo in a millennial's Instagram story. From gracing the silver screen to inspiring fashion and jewelry, these symbols have proven that they're not just relics of a bygone era, but dynamic icons with staying power. But let's not get too starry-eyed just yet. The allure of hieroglyphs isn't solely about their aesthetic charm. It's also about what they represent, a tantalizing glimpse into a world of pyramids, pharaohs, and forgotten mysteries. Take a look at Hollywood. Movies like The Mummy and Raiders of the Lost Ark have made hieroglyphs synonymous with ancient curses and buried treasure. Sure, it's all a bit theatrical, but the truth is, these films tap into a deep-seated fascination with the unknown. There's something irresistible about the idea that a few well-placed symbols could unlock untold secrets, or, unleash a 1,000-year-old curse. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good ancient mystery, even if it's more fiction than fact? Beyond the silver screen, hieroglyphs have waltzed their way into the fashion world. High-end designers have adopted these symbols, turning them into luxury items that scream sophistication with a dash of mystique. Think of it as wearing a piece of history, literally. And much like the ancient Egyptians who etched their narratives into stone to flaunt their status, modern fashionistas use hieroglyph-inspired accessories to make a statement. It's a nod to the past with a contemporary twist, proving that some things never go out of style, like a little bit of mystery. But let's strip away the romantic veneer for a second and dive into the gritty reality. Hieroglyphs, as thrilling as they seem, were also about mundane documentation. They weren't just the language of pharaohs and guards. They were the ancient world's equivalent of a filing system. Much like today's obsession with documenting every detail of our lives on social media, Egyptians used hieroglyphs to capture everything from harvest yields to royal decrees. It's a reminder that behind every grand narrative lies a whole lot of paperwork. Speaking of paperwork, let's not forget the economic context. Deciphering hieroglyphs wasn't just an academic pursuit. It had real-world implications. The Rosetta Stone, for instance, was a tax decree, a far cry from the mystical artifact it's often portrayed as. Champollions' breakthrough unlocked a treasure trove of economic data that helped historians understand the financial machinery of ancient Egypt. So while the romance of hieroglyphs captures our imagination, their practical applications reveal the nuts and bolts of a complex civilization. Now, what about the social impact? Hieroglyphs were the glue that held ancient Egyptian society together, bridging the gap between the divine and the everyday. In a world where literacy was a rare commodity, scribes wielded immense power, shaping narratives and influencing policy. They were the original influencers, if you will, crafting messages that resonated across time and space. And just like today's media moguls, they understood the value of a well-told story. Yet, despite their importance, hieroglyphs eventually gave way to more streamlined scripts, reflecting the shifting sands of Egyptian society. Demotic and Coptic scripts emerged, catering to the needs of a rapidly changing world. This transition wasn't just about linguistic evolution. It was a reflection of political and cultural shifts as Egypt became more cosmopolitan. Hieroglyphs, once the cornerstone of Egyptian identity, gradually faded into the background, eclipsed by new narratives. But let's circle back to the present. In an age where communication is instantaneous, the allure of hieroglyphs reminds us of a time when words carried weight, when the act of writing was a deliberate, almost sacred ritual. They teach us that while technologies evolve, the fundamentals of storytelling remain unchanged. It's about documenting, remembering, and most importantly, connecting. So, as we conclude this journey through the world of Egyptian hieroglyphs, let's take a moment to appreciate their enduring legacy. They are a testament to humanity's unending quest to understand, to communicate, and to leave a mark. They remind us that history is not just a series of dates and facts, but a tapestry of stories woven across millennia. In the end, hieroglyphs are more than just symbols. They are the whispers of an ancient civilization, echoing through time. They challenge us to look beyond the romanticized narratives and embrace the complexities of history. Because much like life itself, the story of hieroglyphs is one of innovation, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. And that, dear listener, is a tale as old as time, yet as relevant as ever. If you ever thought marine biology and imperial rule didn't mix, Emperor Hirohito of Japan might have a thing or two to say about that. Born in 1901, Hirohito was like the unexpected love child of Darwin and a shogun, with a penchant for sea creatures that could rival any modern-day aquarist. Before he was the stalwart symbol of Japan during World War II, Hirohito was a young prince with a curiosity that stretched as wide as the Pacific Ocean. That curiosity, however, didn't always translate into political savvy, at least not at first. Let's rewind to Hirohito's early days. As the first son of Crown Prince Yasuhito, expectations for Hirohito were loftier than Mount Fuji. His childhood wasn't exactly filled with backyard baseball games. Instead, it was a schedule packed with rigorous education and preparation for a future on the chrysanthemum throne. But somewhere between the Confucian texts and lessons in statesmanship, Hirohito found his aquatic muse. He'd often escape to the imperial gardens, peering into the ponds with the same intensity you might use to binge-watch your favorite series. By the age of 15, Hirohito was already a card-carrying member of the Zoological Society of London, a fact he probably wore with more pride than his princely title. It was in 1926 when Hirohito ascended to the throne, taking over from his father, the ailing Emperor Taisho. Now, Japan in the early 20th century was a place where tradition tangoed with modernity. The nation was flexing its industrial muscles while grappling with Western influences that were as foreign as sushi to a cowboy. Hirohito's ascension came at a time when militarism was gaining a chokehold on the nation's political landscape. Yet here was an emperor who preferred a microscope to a map of military conquests. His early reign was marked by a series of public appearances that were, shall we say, less than smooth. Imagine a young emperor, fresh-faced and slightly awkward, thrust into the limelight of a nation that looked to him for strength, yet saw him in a Western-style suit that seemed to rebel against every fiber of his being. Hirohito's relationship with the Western suit was like that of a teenager forced into a family photo, uncomfortable, stiff, and eager for it to be over. He once reportedly said he felt like he was wearing a suit of armor, which, given the historical context, might not be the metaphor you'd expect from a head of state with a militaristic cabinet looming over him. Despite the sartorial struggles, Hirohito's curious nature extended beyond the marine realm. He was keen on understanding the Western world, which was a bit like trying to learn to surf while standing on a skateboard, ambitious with a high likelihood of a wipeout, but full of potential. His tutors included Englishmen and other Western scholars, who undoubtedly brought a fair share of cultural baggage with them. Hirohito absorbed it all, perhaps dreaming of a Japan that could stand on equal footing with the West through knowledge instead of conflict. But let's not sugarcoat things. Hirohito's reign coincided with some of Japan's darkest chapters. As the 1930s rolled in, the political climate was as turbulent as a typhoon, with nationalist and militaristic factions growing more influential. Hirohito was often seen as a figurehead, with the real strings being pulled by military leaders who had a distinctly different vision for Japan's future. Hirohito's position was precarious, akin to a tightrope walker attempting to cross between skyscrapers during a gale. He had to balance his own vision, one that may have included more coral reefs than battlefields, with the aggressive expansionist agenda that was being pushed by his government. Despite these challenges, Hirohito's fascination with marine life remained undeterred. In 1940, he published a research paper on hydrozoans, a group of small, predatory animals related to jellyfish. It's a testament to his dedication that while the world was bracing for global conflict, Hirohito found time to pen a scientific study. Maybe it was his way of seeking solace in the sea, a retreat from the tempest of politics that swirled around him. However, Hirohito's scientific pursuits didn't exactly endear him to everyone. His public appearances were sometimes met with skepticism, as the emperor's reserved demeanor and scholarly interests seemed at odds with the fiery nationalism that was sweeping through Japan. There were whispers and rumors, the kind that wondered whether an emperor so invested in plankton could truly lead a nation through the storms of war. Yet, there's something almost endearing about an emperor who, amidst the pomp and circumstance, maintained a childlike wonder for the natural world. One could argue that Hirohito's marine biology was more than a hobby. It was a microcosm of his internal struggle. In a world clamoring for conflict, Hirohito found peace in the depths of the ocean, perhaps wishing that diplomacy could be as tranquil as a coral reef. But the tides of history, much like the ocean he adored, were not always calm. As the world edged closer to the chaos of World War II, Hirohito would face challenges that would test the limits of his influence and the depths of his resolve. For now, though, the young emperor stood at the crossroads of tradition and modernity, caught between the currents of an empire that was both a relic of the past and a harbinger of change. Japan was on the brink of a transformation as profound as the metamorphosis of the very marine creatures Hirohito studied with such fervor. But that, dear friends, is a tale for another time. And so, as Japan teetered on the brink of transformation, Hirohito found himself at the helm of a nation hungry for change. But let's dive into the economic soup of the 1930s, where Japan's appetite for resources was as insatiable as a teenager at an all-you-can-eat buffet. You see, Japan was an island nation with big ambitions, but limited natural resources, a bit like trying to host a rock concert with just a ukulele. They needed raw materials to fuel their industrial machine, and the answer was expansion. Enter the era of Japan's expansionist policies, where the nation embarked on a quest to gobble up territories like a game of Risk gone wild. Now, while the rest of the world was sipping its morning coffee, Japan was eyeing the resource-rich regions of Manchuria like a cat eyeing a particularly plump canary. In 1931, the Japanese Kwantung Army, acting without Hirohito's explicit orders, staged the Mukden Incident, a ruse as transparent as a politician's promise. This false flag operation gave them the pretext to invade Manchuria, which they did with the finesse of a bulldozer at a flower show. By 1932, Manchuria was transformed into the puppet state of Manchukuo, with a shiny new emperor, Pudi, who was about as powerful as a toy soldier in a boardroom full of generals. Hirohito's role in these machinations is a subject of hot debate, as fiery as wasabi on a sushi roll. Was he a puppet, merely nodding along to the tunes of his military advisors, or was he more of a power player, subtly influencing the direction of his nation? The truth, as always, is more nuanced than a soap opera plot twist. While Hirohito might not have been the mastermind behind these aggressive moves, he certainly wasn't just a passive observer. He was more like a chess player, making strategic moves while being acutely aware of the power dynamics on the board. As Japan continued its expansionist spree, the political climate at home was heating up faster than a Tokyo summer. Militarism was becoming the fashion of the day, with generals strutting about like peacocks in uniform. Meanwhile, Hirohito, in the background, was trying to balance the scales, supporting modern scientific endeavors while navigating the rough seas of political ambition. It was a juggling act that would have impressed even the most seasoned circus performer. Economically, Japan faced pressures that could have given even the Buddha a migraine. The Great Depression had hit the global economy like a wrecking ball, and Japan was no exception. Exports plummeted, and the rural economy was as parched as a desert, driving Japan to look outward for solutions. The need for raw materials and markets for their goods was as pressing as ever, fueling the fire of expansionism. This economic desperation was a driving force behind the country's aggressive policies, a harsh reality that underpinned the romanticized narratives of imperial glory. And then there was the imperial rescript on education, a document so thrilling it could have doubled as a sleep aid. Issued in 1890, but still influential during Hirohito's reign, it was essentially a moral code, urging the Japanese people to cultivate virtues like loyalty, filial piety, and of course, a willingness to sacrifice for the emperor and the state. It was the kind of document that made schoolchildren across Japan groan in unison, yet it laid the ideological groundwork for the militaristic fervor that followed. The rescript was recited in schools with the same reverence one might reserve for a national anthem, embedding values that would later manifest in Japan's wartime zeal. So, where does Hirohito fit into this complex tapestry? The myth of him as a mere puppet is tempting, offering the allure of a tragic figure caught in the machinations of a military that wielded power like a child with a stick of dynamite. But the reality is more intricate. Hirohito was not a powerless figurehead. He was an emperor navigating a labyrinth of political intrigue, trying to maintain his vision of a modern, scientifically advanced Japan while dealing with a military that often acted with the autonomy of a rogue elephant. As conflict loomed on the horizon, Hirohito's position was precarious. He was the emperor of a nation poised to challenge the existing world order, driven by economic necessity and nationalist fervor. Yet he was also a man with a deep appreciation for the natural world, a scholar who once found solace in the study of the sea's mysteries. This duality is what makes Hirohito such a fascinating figure, a leader who stood at the intersection of tradition and modernity, peace and conflict. With the world on the edge of war, Japan's expansionist policies were about to lead them into a global conflict that would test the mettle of an emperor and reshape the fate of nations. But for now, Hirohito remained a symbol of continuity in a rapidly changing world, beacon of imperial authority in a storm of uncertainty. The question of his true influence, puppet or player, remains a topic for debate, a tantalizing mystery that continues to intrigue historians and laymen alike. As Japan prepared to embark on its most ambitious and perilous journey yet, Hirohito's legacy was being forged in the crucible of history, a tale of power, politics, and the unyielding tides of change. But the story, as they say, is far from over. As Japan steered toward the stormy seas of World War II, Emperor Hirohito found himself grappling with a nation that was quickly swapping its kimono for a military uniform. It was the era of kamikaze pilots and code of Bushido, where the romanticized image of the samurai morphed into something far more sinister. In the backdrop, Hirohito's influence, or lack thereof, was a puzzle wrapped in the enigma of Imperial Japan's wartime decisions. So, let's unravel this tapestry, string by string, and see where the threads truly lead. December 7, 1941, was a day that would live in infamy, or at least that's how Franklin D. Roosevelt put it. For Japan, it was a calculated move. The attack on Pearl Harbor was orchestrated with the precision of a samurai blade, catching the U.S. Pacific Fleet with its proverbial pants down. Now, whether Hirohito was the puppet master or merely a figurehead nodding along is a question that's been debated with the fervor of a late-night TV host. He was informed of the plan on December 1, 1941, and gave his consent, a term loaded with as much nuance as a political campaign promise. But let's talk numbers. The attack involved 6 aircraft carriers, 353 Japanese planes, and took place in 2 waves over just 110 minutes. The result? Over 400 Americans killed and 178 wounded, which catapulted the U.S. into the global conflict faster than a bullet train. Hirohito, meanwhile, was left to navigate the public relations fallout like a celebrity caught in a scandal. The Japanese government spun this as a preemptive strike, a bold move in their quest for Pacific dominance, while propaganda painted Hirohito as the divine architect of Japan's destiny. This PR machine was something else, an orchestra of bizarre spins and nationalistic fervor. From newsreels depicting Hirohito as a demigod to schoolchildren pledging undying loyalty, the emperor was portrayed as both the infallible leader and the benevolent paternal figure. But behind the curtains, the realities were far less glamorous. Japan's military campaigns were stretching their resources thinner than a crepe, and the economic pressure was intensifying. The cost of the war effort was astronomical, with military expenditures skyrocketing from 4 billion yen in 1937 to a jaw-dropping 52 billion yen by 1944. While Japan's leaders envisioned a swift victory, the war slogged on like a never-ending traffic jam. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a pivotal turning point, a clash that saw Japan lose 4 of its aircraft carriers, effectively gutting its naval air power. Hirohito's role during these military debacles was more of a tightrope act than a grand performance. He received regular briefings, but his ability to sway decisions was akin to trying to steer a ship with a toothpick. Despite the romanticized image of a god emperor, Hirohito was often a spectator in his own theater, watching as the military brass called the shots with the zeal of a kid high on sugar. The propaganda machine, however, continued to churn out narratives as fantastical as a fairy tale. The image of the emperor as a divine ruler was drilled into the Japanese psyche, fueled by tales of his supposed divine ancestry and the ritualistic reverence surrounding his public appearances. It was a national mythology of epic proportions, a story that painted Hirohito as an untouchable deity guiding Japan toward its manifest destiny. Yet, the harsh reality was that Japan's military strategies were faltering, and the emperor's influence was as elusive as the whispers of court intrigue. By 1944, the Allied forces were closing in, and Japan was feeling the pinch of dwindling resources and mounting casualties. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was another catastrophic blow, marking the largest naval battle in history with over 200 naval personnel involved. Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, and nearly 10 men. It was a disaster of titanic proportions, yet the propaganda spun it as a heroic stand, highlighting the glorious sacrifice of their forces, a narrative that was as hollow as a bamboo flute. The kamikaze pilots became the grim symbol of Japan's desperation, young men sent on suicide missions with the expectation of martyrdom. This was the ultimate expression of the Bushido spirit, a grotesque distortion of samurai ideals that turned self-sacrifice into national policy. Hirohito, in his palace, was faced with reports of these missions, his influence as intangible as the prayers offered in his name. The emperor's image, as a benevolent leader, was clashing with the grim reality of a nation willing to throw its youth into the jaws of destruction. Amidst the chaos, Japan's economy was straining under the weight of total war. The home front was experiencing shortages of food, fuel, and basic necessities. Rationing became the norm, and the black market flourished like weeds in an untended garden. Inflation soared, and by 1945, the yen had lost much of its value, a testament to the economic turmoil that lay beneath the surface of wartime propaganda. Hirohito's leadership was a complex dance, a performance where the steps were dictated by the military and the expectations of the Japanese people. The romanticized image of the God Emperor was at odds with the gritty realities of war, a dichotomy that defined Hirohito's wartime reign. While the emperor might have been the face of Japan's imperial ambition, the true power often lay with the generals who plotted their courses like captains of a sinking ship. As the war dragged on, the gap between Hirohito's public persona and the private realities grew ever wider. The emperor was a symbol, a figurehead caught in the tides of history, steering a nation through the storm with all the control of a leaf in a hurricane. Yet, even as the battles raged and the propaganda continued, the winds of change were beginning to shift. The story of Hirohito's leadership was far from over, and the final chapters were yet to be written in the annals of history. But that, dear friends, is a tale for another time. As the story of Hirohito's wartime leadership unfolded, Japan found itself on a collision course with destiny, barreling towards the final stages of a war that had already left much of the world in tatters. The summer of 1945 was a season of desperation and dwindling options, with Japan's military strategy unraveling faster than a poorly knitted sweater. The Allies were closing in, tightening the noose with relentless air raids that turned cities into ash-laden memories. Tokyo, once a bustling metropolis, had been reduced to a smoking ruin, a grim testament to the firebombing raids that razed nearly half the city in March of that year. Over 100,000 civilians perished in a single night, more than the combined death toll of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then came the atomic bombings, a new kind of horror delivered with a clinical precision that was as cold as it was devastating. On August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima was forever changed in an instant, obliterated by a single bomb, quaintly nicknamed Little Boy. Over 140,000 people were either killed immediately or succumbed to their injuries in the following months. Just 3 days later, on August 9, Nagasaki endured a similar fate with Fat Man, resulting in an additional 70,000 deaths. These were not just numbers. They were a seismic shift in warfare, a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for destruction. Hirohito, in the confines of the imperial palace, was confronted with this monumental reality. The decision to surrender was not just a tactical retreat. It was a psychological earthquake for a nation that had been indoctrinated to believe in the divine right of the emperor and the invincibility of Japan. The military was divided, with some factions preferring a last stand, a suicidal defense of the homeland that would make thermonuclear devastation look like a dress rehearsal. Yet pragmatism began to seep in, a realization that the war was lost, and with it, the old order. In this crucible of conflict and capitulation, Hirohito made a choice that would forever redefine his legacy. On August 15, 1945, he addressed the nation via radio, a first in Japanese history. His voice, previously unheard by the common populace, crackled through the airwaves in what would be known as the dual-voice broadcast. The speech was a masterclass in rhetoric, cloaked in the formal, almost cryptic language that left many listeners scrambling for meaning. But make no mistake, this was a surrender, a capitulation to the Allied forces, an end to a war that had consumed millions of lives. The moment was surreal, a cultural shockwave akin to discovering your favorite podcaster was an AI the whole time. For the Japanese people, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda. Hearing their emperor speak in human tones was as unnerving as it was enlightening. It was a revelation wrapped in a mystery, the divine figure suddenly mortal, his voice carrying the weight of an empire's collapse. In his address, Hirohito cited the unspeakable power of the atomic bomb as a driving factor behind the decision to surrender, a nod to the grim reality that Japan's continued resistance would lead only to further annihilation. The speech was not just about ending the war. It was about preserving what remained of Japan's dignity, a narrative that attempted to salvage honor from the jaws of defeat. Following the surrender, Hirohito's role shifted dramatically. The emperor, once a symbol of divine authority, found himself navigating the choppy waters of occupation and reconstruction. Under the watchful eye of General Douglas MacArthur and the Allied forces, Japan began the arduous process of rebuilding. The emperor's position was redefined, stripped of its divine trappings, and reimagined within a constitutional framework that echoed Western democratic ideals. The post-war era was a time of profound transformation, a societal upheaval that reshaped Japan from the emperor down to the common citizen. The economy, decimated by the war, began a slow, painstaking recovery. The Japanese miracle, as it would later be known, was a testament to human resilience and ingenuity, a phoenix rising from the ashes of conflict. Hirohito, now a constitutional monarch, became a symbol of continuity, a reassuring presence in a nation eager to forge a new identity on the global stage. Yet, the myth of Hirohito as a passive figurehead persisted, a narrative that overshadowed the complexities of his leadership. It was tempting to view him as a tragic puppet, manipulated by the machinations of a militant regime. But the truth was more nuanced, a tapestry of intention and circumstance, where Hirohito's actions were guided as much by political necessity as personal conviction. The emperor's post-war transformation was as much about survival as it was about adaptation. By embracing his new role, Hirohito helped shepherd Japan into an era of peace and prosperity, a modern state that balanced tradition with innovation. The old Japan, with its imperial ambitions and militaristic zeal, was a relic of the past, a cautionary tale buried beneath the rubble of war. As Hirohito continued his reign into the latter half of the 20th century, he became a living testament to the enduring power of change. His story was not just one of wartime leadership, but of post-war reconciliation, a journey that mirrored Japan's own path from devastation to renewal. The emperor's voice, once a symbol of surrender, became a beacon of hope and resilience, a reminder that even the most entrenched traditions could evolve in the face of history's relentless march. And so, the narrative of Hirohito's wartime reign and subsequent transformation remains a complex, multifaceted tale. It's a story of power and politics, myth and reality, where the lines between legend and history blur in the fog of war and the clarity of peace. As we move forward, exploring the legacy of an emperor who straddled the worlds of conflict and reconciliation, we find ourselves on the brink of understanding how one man's journey reflected the broader saga of a nation reborn. But that, dear friends, is a tale for another time. But as we delve into Hirohito's post-war life, let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't a fairy tale transformation from wartime emperor to gentle environmentalist. Instead, it was a metamorphosis as complex as the emperor's beloved hydrozoans, full of twists, turns, and more than a few tentacles of intrigue. Hirohito's post-war era was marked by a deliberate shedding of his imperial skin, trading the divine aura for a more approachable, almost grandfatherly persona. The Allied occupation of Japan, led by the ever-charismatic General Douglas MacArthur, was a period of intense scrutiny for Hirohito. The emperor, once untouchable, found himself navigating the precarious waters of post-war politics with the finesse of a diplomat and the caution of a man walking on eggshells. His first major act was renouncing his divine status in 1946, a move that was as shocking as it was necessary. This declaration, known as the Humanity Declaration, was akin to a pop star admitting they lip-synced their greatest hits. It was both a bombshell and a relief, dismantling the myth of imperial divinity that had underpinned Japan's wartime ethos. Yet, Hirohito's transformation wasn't just a PR stunt. He genuinely embraced a new role, one that focused on fostering peace and understanding. His visits to war-torn areas weren't just photo ops. They were part of a broader effort to reconnect with a nation that had been shattered by conflict. These tours, often conducted with the kind of humility you'd expect from a local mayor rather than an emperor, were a stark contrast to the pomp and circumstance of his pre-war appearances. Hirohito, now more of a figurehead than a ruler, became a symbol of Japan's rebirth, a living bridge between the country's imperial past and its democratic future. The economic landscape of post-war Japan was as barren as a sushi bar without fish. The country was in ruins, its industrial might reduced to rubble by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. But here's where the story gets interesting. Japan's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The Marshall Plan may have been the poster child for European reconstruction, but Japan's economic revival was a homegrown affair. By the 1960s, the nation had transformed into an economic powerhouse, with industries like electronics and automobiles leading the charge. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a reinvention, with Japan rising from the ashes like a phoenix, albeit one that preferred Toyota to Talons. Hirohito played a crucial, albeit understated, role in this economic renaissance. His support for science and technology, once a personal passion, now aligned perfectly with Japan's national interests. He encouraged initiatives that prioritized education and innovation, laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most technologically advanced societies in the world. The emperor's interest in marine biology, once seen as an eccentric hobby, now mirrored Japan's broader focus on research and development, a symbol of the country's commitment to progress and modernization. But let's not turn Hirohito into a saint just yet. The post-war narrative often glosses over the controversies that dogged his legacy. The debate over his wartime responsibility remains a contentious issue, with some historians arguing that he could have done more to prevent Japan's descent into militarism. Yet, the Tokyo trials, which saw many of Japan's wartime leaders prosecuted for war crimes, left Hirohito untouched, a decision driven more by political pragmatism than a clear-cut assessment of his culpability. The Allies, particularly the United States, feared that prosecuting the emperor would destabilize Japan, undermining the very peace they sought to establish. So, Hirohito remained on the throne, a living relic of a bygone era, yet a necessary fixture in the New World Order. As we move into the latter half of the 20th century, Hirohito's public persona underwent another transformation. He became a passionate advocate for environmental conservation, a shift that surprised many but seemed a natural extension of his lifelong interest in the natural world. His focus on conservation was more than a personal passion. It was a reflection of global trends, as awareness of environmental issues grew alongside industrialization. Hirohito's efforts to preserve Japan's natural heritage resonated with a populace increasingly concerned about pollution and the loss of biodiversity, a concern that was as modern as the Walkman and as pressing as climate change. Hirohito's environmental advocacy wasn't just about saving whales and coral reefs. It was about fostering a deeper connection between the Japanese people and their environment. In a nation where land is scarce and natural resources are limited, this focus on conservation was both pragmatic and visionary. Hirohito's legacy as an environmentalist is a testament to his ability to evolve, to adapt to changing times and priorities. It was a reminder that even an emperor could be a catalyst for change, a voice for the voiceless, whether they be fish, fowl, or flora. So, where does this leave us in the grand tapestry of history? How do we reconcile the multifaceted legacy of an emperor who straddled both the tumult of war and the promise of peace? Hirohito's story is one of transformation, of evolution in the face of adversity. It's a narrative that's as much about survival as it is about leadership, about the ability to adapt and endure in a world that's constantly changing. It's about the myth and the man, the legend and the reality, intertwined in a dance as intricate as the ebb and flow of the tides. In the end, Hirohito's legacy is as complex as the emperor himself, a reflection of a nation that rose from the ashes of war to become a beacon of peace and progress. It's a story that's both inspirational and cautionary, a reminder of the power of transformation and the enduring influence of history. As we close this chapter on Hirohito, we find not just an emperor, but a symbol of Japan's journey. A journey that's far from over, and one that continues to unfold with each passing day. And that, dear friends, is the true legacy of Emperor Hirohito. Long before Nelson Mandela became the poster child for resilience and reconciliation, he was a young boy named Ralehlala, which, funnily enough, translates to pulling the branch of a tree, or more colloquially, troublemaker. So, let's just say destiny was already taking notes. Born in 1918 in the village of Mvizo in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, Mandela's early life wasn't exactly the rags-to-riches tale we sometimes hear about. His father was the principal counselor to the acting king of the Thembu people, so young Ralehlala was more prince-in-training than pauper. Now, Mandela's schooling is where the narrative gets its first plot twist. He kicked off his education at the local missionary school, where, in a move that would make any rebranding expert proud, he was given the name Nelson by his teacher. Why Nelson? Because why not? This was the era when colonial educators thought giving African kids English names was the height of cultural exchange. But back to the classroom. Education wasn't free. It was financed by the family, and Mandela's father had to fork out for school fees. Given that his father's passing left the family in a financial pickle, it was Mandela's mother who ensured he continued his education, showing early on that the women in his life were the unsung heroes of his story. The cost of education at the time was not just monetary. It also came with the hefty price of westernization, as students were taught to admire the British Empire and its values. So, while Mandela was busy memorizing the kings and queens of England, the political climate around him was simmering with racial tension and inequality. South Africa, in the early 20th century, was a patchwork quilt of social and political unrest, stitched together by the threads of colonialism and segregation. As Mandela grew, so did his awareness of the world around him. He attended Heeltown, a Westline college in Fort Beaufort, where he furthered his studies. But it was at the University of Fort Hare, the only residential university for black Africans at the time, where Mandela's story starts to resemble more of a coming-of-age drama than a straight path to greatness. At Fort Hare, he was elected to the Student Representative Council, but his tenure was short-lived. Mandela and his companions staged a boycott to protest the quality of food and lack of power students had in university affairs. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. He was expelled for his efforts, which shows that even future Nobel Peace Prize winners have to face the music sometimes. The political landscape of South Africa was a tangled mess of oppressive laws and racial discrimination, courtesy of the British and Dutch settlers who had taken over the land like it was their backyard. The Native Lands Act of 1913, which was the first major legislation passed by the Union of South Africa, reserved about 7% of the land for black South Africans, who made up over 80% of the population. This was not a promising start for equality. In this environment, Mandela's early experiences were more like a primer in inequality rather than a hero's journey. Mandela's life took another turn when he decided to escape an arranged marriage cooked up by his guardian, the regent Jangintaba. Armed with nothing but a sense of adventure and a little cash, he and his cousin Justice fled to Johannesburg. It was 1941, and Johannesburg was a city that promised opportunities, but delivered them with a side of gritty reality. For Mandela, it was a crash course in urban survival. He worked as a night watchman at Crown Mines, one of the world's largest gold mines, until he was fired because the regent was on his trail, demanding his return. Johannesburg, a city teetering between modernity and chaos, became Mandela's classroom. He eventually found work as a law clerk at a firm run by a Jewish lawyer, Lazar Seidelsky, a man who, in an era of rampant racism, believed in giving black South Africans a chance. This job allowed Mandela to finish his degree through correspondence, a testament to the fact that his path was less about destiny and more about determination and a pinch of serendipity. So, there you have it, the origin story of Nelson Mandela, a young man not quite marching towards destiny, but rather stumbling and learning as he went. Far from the simple tale of a hero's rise, Mandela's early years were filled with the kinds of hurdles and setbacks that make for a more honest, if less romantic, narrative. And while the legend of Mandela looms large, It's important to remember that he was once a young man in a complicated world, just trying to find his place. As Mandela settled into Johannesburg, his life took on the rhythm of a young man caught up in the city's frenetic energy. But he wasn't just another face in the crowd. Oh no, Mandela was a burgeoning legal eagle, a man with ambition, and it turns out, a penchant for getting into good trouble. By 1943, he was enrolled at the University of Witwatersrand, rubbing shoulders with a diverse crowd that included future leaders, activists, and a handful of folks who probably just want to pass their exams. This was a melting pot of ideas and ideologies, and Mandela was soaking it all in. Now, let's talk about the African National Congress, ANC, the political outfit that would become Mandela's lifelong love affair. Back then, the ANC was like a vintage car in desperate need of a tune-up. Founded in 1912, it had been purring along quietly, but the roar of apartheid was getting louder. Enter Mandela, who joined the ANC in 1944, along with a group of young Turks ready to shake things up. This was the birth of the ANC Youth League, a bunch of firebrands with a shared goal: to turn the ANC from a genteel protest group into a political powerhouse. They were the rebels with a cause, and Mandela was front and center. In the late 1940s, Mandela's political career was like a whirlwind romance with radical change. The Youth League was all about action, and they weren't interested in playing nice. Their mantra, African leadership for Africans. It was a call to arms, and the Youth League wanted to rattle the apartheid cage with campaigns that would make the establishment sit up and take notice. And in 1949, they got their chance. The ANC adopted a radical program of action, largely inspired by the Youth League's fiery rhetoric. This was not the kind of moderate approach that Mandela initially championed. It was a full-throttle challenge to the status quo. But let's not get carried away with visions of epic speeches and grand gestures. Mandela's early political maneuvering was less about leading the charge and more about learning the ropes. He was still playing catch-up, figuring out how to move the pieces on the apartheid chessboard. The reality was that South Africa's political landscape was a minefield, and one wrong move could cost you more than just your political career. But Mandela, with his legal training and growing influence, was ready to make his move. By 1952, the stage was set for one of the ANC's boldest maneuvers yet, the Defiance Campaign. Picture this: a mass movement of civil disobedience designed to flout apartheid laws and flood jails with protesters. It was ambitious, audacious, and just the kind of thing that could backfire spectacularly. But the campaign was successful in mobilizing thousands, and Mandela was one of its chief architects. As the national volunteer-in-chief, he crisscrossed the country, rallying people with a charisma that could light up a room, or a courtroom, as it turns out. Ah yes, the courtroom antics. Mandela was no stranger to the inside of a courtroom during this time, and his flair for drama made him quite the headline grabber. In 1952, he and 19 others faced charges under the Suppression of Communism Act for their role in the Defiance Campaign. The trial was less about guilt or innocence and more about making a political statement. Mandela used the platform to highlight the absurdity of the apartheid laws, turning the courtroom into a stage for his oratory skills. It was a performance that blended legal acumen with a touch of theater, a real showstopper. Spoiler alert, they were found guilty, but the sentencing was suspended, allowing Mandela to walk free, at least for a while. However, being on the ANC's front lines came with its own set of challenges. The government was not amused by Mandela's antics and kept a watchful eye on his activities. In the 1950s, he was banned multiple times, which is a fancy way of saying he was put under house arrest and restricted from attending public gatherings. Imagine trying to lead a revolution from your living room, talk about an uphill battle. Despite these setbacks, Mandela's reputation as a leader and a symbol of resistance continued to grow. He was a man caught in the crosshairs of history, and the stakes were getting higher. By the mid-1950s, the country was a pressure cooker of racial tension, and Mandela was smack dab in the middle of it all. Yet, it wasn't just the political arena where Mandela was making waves. He was also a family man, juggling the demands of a growing household. In 1944, he married Evelyn Mace, a union that produced 4 children. But balancing the revolution with family life was no easy feat. The strain of political activism took its toll, and by 1957, the marriage was over. It was a reminder that even icons have to grapple with the messiness of personal relationships. As we edge towards the late 1950s, the narrative of Mandela's life starts to resemble a suspense thriller. The government was cracking down on activists like Mandela, desperate to maintain control. The treason trial of 1956 was yet another dramatic chapter in his life. Mandela, along with 155 others, was arrested and charged with treason. The trial dragged on for 4 years, a marathon of legal wrangling that tested everyone's patience. Spoiler alert, they were all acquitted, but the trial was a stark reminder of how the legal system could be wielded as a weapon of oppression. Through all this, Mandela remained undeterred. He was becoming more than just a man. He was a symbol of defiance. Yet, it's important to remember that this wasn't some linear march to greatness. Mandela's early political career was a series of missteps, recalibrations, and against-the-odds victories. It was messy, complicated, and fraught with danger, just like the world he was trying to change. The late 1950 and early 1960 were a turning point for Mandela. As the apartheid regime tightened its grip, Mandela realized that the ANC's non-violent strategies needed a rethink. It was time for a new approach, one that would eventually see him labeled as a most wanted figure by the government. But that's a tale for another time. For now, let's leave Mandela standing at the crossroads of history, poised to make the choices that would define not just his life, but the future of a nation. Stay tuned, because the story only gets more intriguing from here. As Mandela stood on the brink of a new era, the stakes couldn't have been higher. He was about to embark on a journey that would transform him from a fiery leader into a global symbol of resilience. Enter the infamous Robben Island, a place that sounds like it could be a sunny getaway, but is in fact the Alcatraz of South Africa. Spoiler alert, there were no margaritas. Mandela's stint on Robben Island began in 1964 after being sentenced to life imprisonment during the Rivonia trial. His cell was a stark, Spartan 8 feet by 7 feet, barely enough room to pace and ponder his next chess move against apartheid. Imagine living in a space smaller than your average parking spot. The cell came with essentials: a bucket for a toilet, a thin mat for a bed, and a small window to remind him of the freedom just out of reach. Let's debunk a myth right here. Mandela's time on Robben Island wasn't just a heroic montage of stoic endurance. The reality was grueling. Days were spent breaking rocks in a limestone quarry under a sun that seemed intent on turning inmates into human toast. The glare was so intense that Mandela's eyesight was permanently damaged, a painful souvenir of his staycation on the island. Despite these conditions, Mandela's leadership style underwent a transformative evolution. He turned the prison yard into a university of sorts, aptly nicknamed Robben Island University. Here, Mandela and his fellow inmates engaged in fierce debates, covering everything from politics to philosophy, demonstrating that even in confinement, the mind could roam free. This wasn't just a survival tactic. It was a masterclass in resilience and intellectual empowerment. Now, let's talk economics, because even behind bars, numbers mattered. Mandela's imprisonment was a costly affair, not just for him, but for the apartheid regime. The government funneled vast resources into maintaining Robben Island as a maximum security facility, and it was a public relations nightmare on the international stage. The world was watching, and every day Mandela spent behind bars was another ding in South Africa's already tarnished reputation. The economic implications of maintaining apartheid were coming home to roost, and Mandela's imprisonment was a key piece of that puzzle. Gallows humor was a coping mechanism, and Mandela was no stranger to it. He famously remarked that the guards could imprison his body, but his mind was free, a sentiment that had all the makings of a motivational poster, minus the inspirational sunset. It was this mindset that kept him going, and it resonated with his fellow inmates, turning despair into determination. While Mandela was honing his leadership skills in prison, the outside world was shifting. Global pressure on the apartheid regime was mounting, and the economic sanctions were beginning to bite. South Africa's GDP was taking a hit, and international boycotts were making the country as popular as a skunk at a garden party. This was the larger chess game that Mandela was playing, using his imprisonment to draw attention to the injustices of apartheid. Despite the bleakness, Mandela managed to build bridges with his jailers, a strategic move that would later pay dividends. He learned Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, and engaged them in dialogue, slowly but surely planting seeds of doubt about the righteousness of apartheid. It was less about winning hearts and more about outmaneuvering minds, a testament to his tactical acumen. Mandela's time on Robben Island wasn't just about surviving, it was about strategizing for the future. He knew that the battle against apartheid wouldn't be won with brute force, but with a shift in mindset. As he chipped away at stones in the quarry, he was also chipping away at the resolve of an oppressive regime, one conversation at a time. In the grand narrative of Mandela's life, Robben Island is often romanticized as a place of solitary heroism. But the truth is far more complex. It was a crucible of suffering and strength, where Mandela's leadership was tested and tempered. It was a place where the man became a movement, and the world began to see him not just as a prisoner, but as a beacon of hope. As the years ticked by, Mandela's influence only grew. He was no longer just Nelson Mandela, prisoner number 46,664. He was a symbol of the struggle for freedom, a living indictment of the apartheid regime. His story wasn't just about his own endurance, but about the persistence of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And so, Mandela's time on Robben Island was not the end of his journey, but rather a pivotal chapter in a story that was still unfolding. The world continued to watch, waiting to see what the next move would be in this high-stakes game of political chess. And as Mandela bided his time, the wheels of history kept turning, setting the stage for the next act in his remarkable life. Stay tuned, because this tale of courage and cunning is far from over. As the world continued its vigil over Nelson Mandela's imprisonment, winds of change were stirring, and not just in the political corridors of South Africa. By the late 1980, Mandela was no longer just a prisoner. He was a global icon, a moral compass in a world muddled by contradictions. His release was as anticipated as the latest blockbuster, but instead of red carpets, it involved a labyrinth of negotiations that would make even the most seasoned diplomat break into a cold sweat. February 11, 1990, marked the day Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, hand in hand with his then-wife Winnie. Cue the media frenzy. If Mandela's release was a reality TV moment, it would have been the season finale, packed with suspense, tears, and the kind of worldwide attention that made the Kardashians look like local news. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled, and the world leaned in to catch the first glimpse of the man who had become a beacon of hope. But let's not romanticize it too much. Mandela's release wasn't a spontaneous act of goodwill from the apartheid regime, but rather the result of painstaking negotiations that had been simmering since the mid-1980. Behind closed doors, government officials and ANC representatives were engaged in a delicate dance, each side trying to outmaneuver the other while keeping their eyes on the bigger prize, a peaceful transition to democracy. The apartheid government, under President F.W. de Klerk, wasn't just bowing to moral pressure. South Africa's economy was in the doldrums, battered by international sanctions that had shrunk its GDP by around 5% annually during the mid-1980. The world wasn't buying South African gold, and the only thing less popular than the rand was, well, apartheid itself. De Klerk knew the regime had to change or face economic collapse, a choice between the frying pan and the fire. Mandela, ever the strategist, understood that the negotiations were as much about economic salvation as they were about human rights. The stakes were high, and the path forward was anything but clear. It was a game of political chess, and both sides were keenly aware that a misstep could plunge the country into chaos. Spoiler alert, the transition wasn't smooth sailing, but more of a turbulent roller coaster ride with plenty of hairpin turns. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the world's sudden discovery of Mandela. For decades, he was a ghost in the media, a spectral figure mentioned in hushed tones. But once he stepped out of prison, the global narrative shifted. Suddenly, Mandela was everywhere. Time magazine, Nobel Peace Prize discussions, even in pop culture. It was as if the world had collectively exclaimed, "Nelson, where have you been all our lives?" with no hint of irony about their previous indifference. However, Mandela's newfound celebrity status was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it amplified the call for change. On the other, it put him under a microscope, where every decision was scrutinized, debated, and dissected. The media painted him as a near-mythical figure, a saintly warrior for justice. But Mandela himself was quick to debunk such idealism. He famously quipped, "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." Cue the existential crisis among journalists who had already written him into sainthood. As Mandela and de Klerk navigated the treacherous waters of negotiation, the economic challenges of transforming South Africa into a unified nation loomed large. The country was a tapestry of inequality, with the white minority holding the lion's share of wealth and resources, while the black majority lived in poverty. The task was Herculean, to dismantle apartheid's economic structures without triggering a financial meltdown. Mandela's leadership during this time was nothing short of visionary. He understood that political freedom was hollow without economic equality. But how do you redistribute wealth in a nation built on systemic inequality? It wasn't as simple as waving a magic wand or a mandate from the electorate. It required bold policy changes, international investment, and a whole lot of patience. One of Mandela's most significant moves was to prioritize reconciliation over retribution, a decision that baffled many. Here was a man who had every reason to hold a grudge, yet he chose dialogue and diplomacy over vengeance. It wasn't just a moral choice, but a practical one. Mandela knew that a peaceful transition was critical to attracting foreign investment and stabilizing the economy. A civil war wouldn't just be tragic, it would be financially catastrophic. As negotiations progressed, the political chessboard was in constant flux. The ANC had to manage internal divisions while engaging with various factions, from the Inkatha Freedom Party to the white right-wing groups who saw democracy as a threat to their way of life. It was a juggling act worthy of a circus performer, and Mandela was the ringmaster, steering the process with a blend of charm, pragmatism, and an iron will. The world watched with bated breath as South Africa lurched towards its first democratic elections in 1994. It was a momentous occasion, but one fraught with tension. Violence flared up in parts of the country, and the specter of political instability loomed large. Yet, against all odds, the elections were a triumph, with Mandela becoming South Africa's first black president, a moment that resonated across the globe. In the aftermath of the elections, Mandela faced the daunting task of building a rainbow nation. It was an ambitious vision, but not without its pitfalls. The economic disparities were stark, the infrastructure was crumbling, and the social fabric was frayed. Mandela's administration had to tackle everything from land reform to education, all while managing a fragile coalition government. Despite the challenges, Mandela remained a unifying figure, a leader who embodied the spirit of forgiveness and forward thinking. His presidency was not without criticism. Some argued he was too conciliatory, while others felt economic progress was sluggish. But the undeniable truth was that Mandela had steered South Africa away from the brink and towards a new dawn. As the curtain fell on Mandela's presidency in 1999, the world marveled at his legacy. He had transformed from a prisoner to a president, from a symbol of resistance to a statesman of reconciliation. His story was far from over, and the lessons of his leadership would echo through history. And so, the tale of Nelson Mandela continued, a narrative rich with complexity, courage, and conviction. As South Africa grappled with the challenges of its nascent democracy, Mandela's influence remained a guiding light, illuminating the path toward a more just and equitable society. But the journey was far from complete, and the story was still unfolding. Stay tuned, because there's more to explore in this epic saga of resilience and redemption. As Mandela stepped down from South Africa's presidency in 1999, the world paused to catch its breath. Here was a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of change with the poise of a tightrope walker carrying a nation on his back. But the job wasn't as glamorous as it looked from afar. Mandela's presidency was a balancing act between the idealism of a rainbow nation and the gritty realities of economic and social upheaval. Let's get down to brass tacks. South Africa's economy was like a fixer-upper house, full of potential, but in desperate need of renovation. The apartheid era had left a legacy of inequality that was more entrenched than a tick on a dog. The numbers told a sobering story. In 1994, the unemployment rate was a staggering 31.5%, and GDP growth was an anemic 0.2%. Yet Mandela's government was tasked with turning this sinking ship into a luxury liner. Cue the Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, Mandela's grand vision for economic reform. It was ambitious, with goals that included building 1 million houses, providing clean water and electricity to millions, and reforming land ownership. It was like trying to build Rome in a day while juggling flaming torches. But here's the kicker. The RDP faced more hurdles than a steeplechase chase. Limited funds, bureaucratic bottlenecks, and political infighting meant that progress was slower than a dial-up internet connection. Then there were the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, TRC, a series of hearings that aimed to heal the wounds of apartheid with truth-telling and forgiveness, a sort of national therapy session. The idea was groundbreaking. Instead of Nuremberg-style trials, South Africa chose to air its dirty laundry in public, hoping that confession would lead to catharsis. Critics scoffed, calling it a truth for amnesty deal. But Mandela understood that without reconciliation, the past's ghosts would haunt the nation's future. The TRCs unearthed harrowing tales of brutality and courage, reminding everyone that history isn't just written in textbooks, but etched in human experience. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Mandela's tenure wasn't all rainbows and reconciliations. The crime rate was soaring, and the HIV/AIDS epidemic was spreading faster than office gossip. In 1999, an estimated 4.2 million South Africans were living with HIV, a crisis that demanded urgent attention. Critics lambasted the government's slow response, and some even whispered that Mandela's iconic status overshadowed the pressing needs of the day. It was a harsh reminder that even the most revered leaders are not immune to missteps. Yet, Mandela's presidency left an indelible mark. His advocacy for peace and equality resonated far beyond South Africa's borders, inspiring movements for justice and human rights worldwide. The man was a masterclass in diplomacy, transforming South Africa from a pariah state to a beacon of democracy. His ability to forgive and forge alliances was not just a political strategy, but a testament to his character. In Mandela's world, enemies were just friends who hadn't yet discovered common ground, a perspective that might sound naive if it weren't so profoundly effective. As Mandela retired from the political spotlight, he transitioned into a role that suited him as comfortably as his signature shirts, a global elder statesman. His foundation tackled issues from education to HIV/AIDS, proving that Mandela's retirement was more like a career change than a farewell tour. He continued to wield influence with the quiet authority of a seasoned chess player who knew when to strike and when to strategize. Mandela's legacy is a curious mix of myth and reality, a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and tribulation. The romanticism surrounding his life is both a blessing and a burden. It's easy to idolize Mandela as a flawless hero, but the truth is far more compelling. He was a man who navigated the complex terrain of human frailty with grace and grit. His story is a reminder that leadership isn't about being infallible, but about being courageous enough to admit mistakes and resilient enough to forge ahead. In the pantheon of history's great figures, Mandela stands out not just for his achievements, but for his humanity, a quality that is often airbrushed out of historical narratives. His life was a series of calculated risks and bold decisions, a testament to what can be accomplished when ideals meet action. Mandela's vision for South Africa was not just about political freedom, but about building a society where everyone had a seat at the table, even if the table was a little wobbly at times. As we reflect on Mandela's legacy, it's crucial to remember that his achievements weren't the product of one man, but the result of a collective struggle. Mandela himself will be the first to deflect the limelight, emphasizing the contributions of countless others who fought alongside him. His life is a reminder that change is never the work of a single individual, but a symphony of voices, each contributing its own unique melody. So, what makes Mandela's story so enduringly compelling? Perhaps it's the realization that his journey mirrors our own aspirations and challenges. He was a leader who dared to dream big, who who saw possibilities where others saw only obstacles. His life is a testament to the power of perseverance and the belief that a better world is always within reach, even if it requires a few detours along the way. In the end, Mandela's legacy is not just a historical footnote, but a living, breathing narrative that continues to inspire and challenge us. His vision for a just and equitable society remains as relevant today as it was in his time. As we navigate our own tumultuous world, Mandela's life serves as a beacon, guiding us toward a future where hope triumphs over despair and where the human spirit prevails against all odds. And that, dear listeners, is why Mandela's story will never lose its luster. In the not-so-sleepy backwater of first-century Britain, the Roman Empire was doing what it did best, expanding like a teenager who just discovered late-night snacks. The Romans, with their shiny armor and impeccable road-building skills, had a knack for making friends, or amicitia, as they called it, with local tribes. This, of course, was the Roman version of sending a friend request with an unspoken or else attached. And in this wild world of political chess, the Iceni tribe found themselves in the spotlight, thanks to a not-so-small oversight involving a warrior queen named Boudica. Now, before Boudica took the stage in what would become one of history's most epic acts of rebellion, let's set the scene. Picture the Roman Empire around 43 AD. They were already ruling the roost across Europe, the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia Minor. But Britain, a land filled with fog, druids, and tribes fiercely attached to their own independence, was the next shiny bauble on their imperial checklist. Enter the Iceni, a tribe nestled in what is now Norfolk. They were led by a client king named Prasutagus, who was a bit like the guy everyone wants at a dinner party. Agreeable, wealthy, and importantly, not prone to causing trouble. As a client king, he was supposed to keep the peace and collect taxes, all while pretending he was still the boss. Prasutagus's reign was relatively uneventful, at least until he made the classic mistake of dying. But before he shuffled off this mortal coil, he penned a will that, if it were a modern email, would have definitely ended up in the spam folder. In an attempt to keep everyone happy, he left his kingdom to both his daughters and Emperor Nero. Yes, that Nero, the one with a penchant for fiddles and pyrotechnics. Prasutagus thought this would ensure peace. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The Romans, who read amicitia contracts like they were their own personal playbooks, decided that with Prasutagus gone, the Iceni should be absorbed fully into the Roman Empire. Cue the ominous music. This was akin to your landlord deciding your apartment is now theirs because you missed one rent payment. Boudica, Prasutagus's widow, suddenly found herself in the unenviable position of dealing with these so-called friends. The Romans, ever the sticklers for protocol, seized the opportunity to remind everyone who was really in charge. They confiscated property, flogged Boudica, and in a twist that would make even the most hardened viewers of Game of Thrones wince, assaulted her daughters. But let's pause here to appreciate the absurdity of the Romans' approach. Remember, these were the people who built aqueducts and invented concrete, yet somehow they thought this was a sound diplomatic move. Their actions were less amicitia and more amicida meet my sword. And thus, the stage was set for Boudica to transform from a sidelined queen into a full-fledged leader of a rebellion that would make even the most seasoned rebel leaders nod in approval. The political landscape was a powder keg, and Boudica was about to light the match. Let's talk numbers. The Romans had around 50,000 troops stationed in Britain, part of the mighty legions that had conquered Gaul and marched into the heart of Germania. But these troops were spread thin, like too little butter on too much toast. Meanwhile, the Iceni and their allies could muster thousands of warriors, fueled by a cocktail of rage, injustice, and a deep-seated desire to reclaim their land and dignity. And here's the kicker. While the Romans were great at conquering, they often forgot the whole winning hearts and minds, part of the occupation package. Boudica's uprising wasn't just about revenge. It was a fight for identity, autonomy, and a rejection of the Roman idea that Britain was just another line on their map. The Iceni, with Boudica at the helm, were ready to remind the Romans that they weren't in Rome anymore. As Boudica prepared for rebellion, she became an icon of resistance. She wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol, a living, breathing embodiment of Celtic defiance. Her story is often romanticized, with visions of her in a chariot, hair flowing in the wind, leading her people into battle. But let's not forget the gritty reality. This was a struggle born from desperation, a reaction to oppression that left little room for anything but fierce determination. The Romans, with their client kingdom contracts that might as well have been written in invisible ink, underestimated Boudica and the flames of rebellion she would stoke. Their miscalculation would soon become clear as Boudica's forces prepared to surge across the land, leaving the Romans scrambling to contain a rebellion that was as much about retribution as it was about reclaiming a future that the Romans had tried to steal. Stay tuned, as the tale of Boudica's rise from wronged queen to warrior leader is far from over. And as the dust settles on this opening act, one thing is clear. The Romans, with all their might and military prowess, were about to learn a lesson in humility at the hands of a woman they had underestimated at their peril. It was a classic case of the Romans playing the imperial game of oops, we did it again, with Boudica now leading the charge against their oversight. As the dust cloud of rebellion rose, fueled by righteous anger and the kind of rage that only a widow with nothing to lose could muster, the stage was set for an epic showdown. So, what exactly lit the fuse? Well, pull up a seat because it's a tale of taxes, tyranny, and the terrible mistake of underestimating a queen with more chariots than they had sense. First up, let's talk taxes. Ever feel like city parking fees are designed to ruin your day? Well, Boudica and her tribe could relate. The Romans had an uncanny ability to turn taxation into a weapon of mass irritation. After Prasutagus' untimely demise and the less-than-welcome Roman assumption of power, the taxes imposed on the Iceni were ratcheted up to levels that would make even modern tax accountants break a sweat. The Romans were demanding payments that felt more like a punishment than a civic duty. It's as if they were charging for the privilege of occupying their own land, which, spoiler alert, they absolutely were. One key player in this financial fiasco was the Roman procurator Decianus Catus, who seemed to have missed the memo on diplomacy. He ramped up the financial demands and confiscated lands with an enthusiasm that would make a repo man nod in approval. His approach was less about gentle persuasion and more about grabbing everything that wasn't nailed down. This was the spark that Boudica needed, a blatant show of Roman arrogance that turned simmering resentment into a full-blown bonfire of rebellion. But let's not forget the personal angle. Boudica wasn't just rallying her people against faceless invaders. This was personal. Her family had been humiliated and brutalized. The Romans had gambled that Boudica would be another silent statistic, just one more conquered soul in their sprawling empire. Instead, they got a warrior queen ready to append their imperial apple cart. If the Romans thought they could simply waltz in and rewrite the rules, they were about to get schooled in the art of Celtic resistance. So, Boudica rallied the troops, and by troops, I mean a ragtag but fiercely determined coalition of the Iceni and neighboring tribes like the Trinovantes. These weren't just warriors, they were farmers, craftsmen, and everyday folks who were done with Roman rules and their highfalutin ways. They were fueled by a cocktail of shared grievances and that timeless motivator, the desire to stick it to the man. And let's not forget, these were people who lived and breathed the land they were fighting for, a far cry from the Roman legions, who were as foreign to this terrain as a tourist with a malfunctioning GPS. Now, the Romans might have had their legions, but Boudica had something they didn't: chariots. Lots of them. Imagine these as the ancient equivalent of tanks, fast, mobile, and when used effectively, utterly terrifying. Boudica's forces had cavalry units too, but it was the chariots that added that extra flair to her rebellion. They were perfect for the guerrilla tactics that Boudica employed, allowing her forces to strike hard and fast before melting back into the landscape like smoke. Here's where the Romans made their next big blunder. They underestimated Boudica's strategic acumen. They assumed she was just another tribal leader with a grudge. What they didn't see coming was her ability to unify disparate tribes and channel their anger into coordinated, effective resistance. This wasn't just a rebellion. It was a movement with Boudica at its fiery heart. As the rebellion gained momentum, the Romans scrambled to respond. They were caught off guard, spread thin across the province, and dealing with uprisings that seemed to pop up faster than a game of whack-a-mole. The legions were powerful, sure, but they were also stretched across vast distances, dealing with supply lines that would make a modern logistics manager weep. It was a logistical nightmare, and Boudica was the nightmare fuel. Her first major target was Camulaginum, modern-day Colchester, a Roman colony that represented everything wrong with the occupation. It was a symbol of Roman power, complete with a temple dedicated to Claudius, the emperor who had brought Britannia under Roman rule. Boudica's forces descended on the colony with a fury that left the Romans reeling. The settlement, poorly defended and overconfident in its Romanness, fell swiftly. Boudica's warriors razed it to the ground, leaving a smoldering ruin in their wake and sending a clear message. Roman supremacy was not as unshakable as they thought. As the rebellion spread, Boudica's forces grew. They were united not just by a common enemy, but by a vision of a future where they could govern themselves, free from Roman interference. And while the Romans were busy trying to put out fires across the province, Boudica was busy lighting them, both literally and metaphorically. It's worth noting that Boudica's uprising wasn't just about destruction. It was about reclamation. She was reclaiming not just land, but the right to determine her people's destiny. Her rebellion was a statement. Rome might have conquered the land, but they hadn't conquered its spirit. And as her forces moved from Camulaginum to Londinium, modern-day London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, they left a trail of destruction that was both a warning and a promise. The Romans, now fully aware of the threat they faced, were finally mobilizing in earnest. But here's the thing about empires. They're slow to react. Bureaucracy and overconfidence had lulled them into a false sense of security. The legions were powerful, but they were also cumbersome, designed for pitched battles rather than the hit-and-run tactics that Boudica excelled at. So, what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Well, stay tuned, because Boudica's rebellion was about to reach a fever pitch, and the Romans were about to learn that even their mighty empire wasn't immune to the power of a determined queen with a score to settle. The stage was set for a clash that would echo through history, a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who refused to be subjugated. The next acts of this drama would unfold with blood, fire, and the relentless march of history, as Boudica continued her legendary fight against the Roman machine. As Boudica's rebellion continued its relentless march, the Romans were about to get schooled in the fine art of when ignoring a problem only makes it worse. Picture this: Roman towns falling like dominoes, each one a testament to the power of an underestimated force fueled by the kind of righteous anger that would make even the most hardened bureaucrat reconsider their life choices. Let's start with Londinium, modern-day London, which back then was barely more than a Roman outpost pretending to be a city. Despite its humble beginnings, it was strategically important, a hub for trade and military logistics. When Boudica's forces approached, the Romans had a decision to make: defend Londinium or cut their losses. Enter Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor with a name that sounds like he could be a character in a Roman soap opera. Suetonius decided Londinium wasn't worth the effort and evacuated, leaving the city open to Boudica's wrath. The result? A level of destruction that could only be described as scorched earth meets ancient urban renewal. But here's where we get into the nitty-gritty of logistics. You see, waging a rebellion isn't just about having more chariots than sense. It's also about managing resources, a bit like running a small country or a particularly rowdy rock band. And Boudica, despite being a warrior queen, had to deal with the practicalities of keeping her troops fed, armed, and motivated. This wasn't a weekend camping trip. It was a full-scale military campaign that required planning and coordination. Ancient warfare, by the way, wasn't cheap. In today's money, the cost of equipping a single warrior could be equivalent to a decent used car. We're talking swords, shields, armor, and those all-important chariots. And while Boudica might not have had a treasury to dip into, she had something better: plunder. The Roman towns, with their wealth and resources, became the piggy banks that Boudica's forces smashed open to fund their rebellion. It's a strategy as old as time. Take what you need from your enemies, and when they complain, remind them that they started it. Meanwhile, the Roman legions were learning the hard way that leaving their defenses on Do Not Disturb was a rookie mistake. The Romans, ever the masters of military might, had become complacent in their occupation of Britain. They built towns and forts, sure, but they hadn't counted on a full-blown insurrection led by a woman who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Their defenses, designed to keep out raiding parties and the odd, disgruntled farmer, weren't prepared for a coordinated assault by thousands of determined warriors. But let's not kid ourselves. The Roman military machine wasn't about to be toppled by a single rebellion, no matter how fierce. The legions were already regrouping, and Suetonius, realizing that underestimating Boudica was a career-limiting move, began to rally his forces for a counterattack. The Roman response was slow, but it was coming, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Now, about those Roman historians, specifically Tacitus and Cassius Dio. These guys wrote the history books, and boy, did they love a good story. Tacitus, the son-in-law of a Roman general, might have had a vested interest in portraying the rebellion as a brutal, bloody affair, complete with exaggerated body counts and dramatic destruction. Cassius Dio, writing a century later, took the drama up a notch, painting Boudica as a larger-than-life figure leading a horde of warriors in an apocalyptic battle for survival. The appeal of their accounts is undeniable. Who doesn't love a tale of rebellion against the odds? But let's take these with a pinch of salt. Roman historians had a tendency to embellish, to turn history into legend, and to make sure Rome came out looking like the eventual savior of civilization. They were the ancient world's version of tabloid journalists, with a flair for the dramatic that would make Shakespeare proud. So, while the stories of Boudica's rebellion are thrilling, they're also a reminder that history is written by the victors, or at least those who had the time and resources to put pen to parchment. The reality was likely more complex, more nuanced, and probably less melodramatic than the historians would have us believe. As Boudica's forces continued their campaign, the rebellion was taking its toll, not just on the Romans, but on her own people. War is a costly affair, and while the initial victories were sweet, the long-term sustainability of the rebellion was a looming question mark. Supplies had to be gathered, alliances maintained, and the constant threat of Roman retaliation was a shadow that hung over every decision. And yet, through all this, Boudica remained a symbol of defiance. Her story wasn't just about the battle she fought, but about the message she sent, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resistance was possible. She was a reminder that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, can rise up and challenge the mightiest of empires. As the rebellion marched on, the Romans were getting ready for a showdown that would test their mettle and their resolve. The stage was set for a clash that would decide the fate of Britain and echo through the ages as a testament to the power of one woman's determination to reclaim her people's future. The next act in this historical drama was about to unfold, and both sides were preparing for a confrontation that will be remembered as one of the ancient world's most epic battles. Stay tuned, because the story of Boudica's rebellion is far from over, and the lessons it holds continue to resonate in our understanding of resistance, power, and the cost of underestimating those who dare to defy. With both sides bracing for the mother of all showdowns, the Roman Empire was finally ready to stop treating Boudica's rebellion like a pesky mosquito and start treating it like the full-blown tempest it was. Cue the dramatic music and pan over to Watling Street, a place that would soon etch itself into the annals of history as the site where the Romans finally decided to get their act together. Enter Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor who wasn't about to let a warrior queen continue to give the mighty Romans a black eye. Suetonius, who had been playing a not-so-fun game of catch-up with Boudica, knew he needed a new strategy. The Romans were excellent at a lot of things, building aqueducts, wearing togas, and most importantly, fighting in formation. It was time to remind everyone why the Roman legions were the most feared force in the ancient world. The Romans chose their battlefield with the precision of a chess master moving a queen into checkmate. They picked a narrow gorge along Watling Street, bordered by woods, perfect for neutralizing the numerical superiority of Boudica's forces. Now, we're talking about a force of about 10,000 disciplined Roman soldiers, the creme de la creme of the Roman military, facing off against Boudica's ragtag army, which, while impressive in size, was less about coordinated tactics and more about raw, unbridled fury. Estimates of her forces range wildly, from 100,000 to 230,000, but let's just say she had no trouble making it a standing room-only event. As Boudica rallied her troops, she gave a speech that would have made any motivational speaker proud. Tacitus, ever the dramatist, claimed she stood in her chariot, her daughters at her side, and implored her warriors to fight for their freedom, their families, and their future. It was a rousing call to arms, the kind of speech that makes you want to charge into battle, or at least take on a particularly challenging spin class. But here's where the cold, hard reality of ancient warfare comes crashing down. Boudica's army, while fearsome and fueled by righteous indignation, was up against Roman discipline, which was as rigid and unyielding as a tax collector's ledger. The Romans formed up in their classic wedge formation, a tactic that had served them well from the dusty plains of Gaul to the forests of Germania. They were like a well-oiled machine, each soldier a cog in the relentless engine of Roman conquest. As the battle commenced, the Romans held their ground, using their shields and short swords, the famous gladii, to devastating effect. The Iceni and their allies, caught in the narrow pass, found themselves unable to flank the Romans or use their chariots to full advantage. It was a tactical nightmare, a cruel twist of fate that saw Boudica's forces funneled into a killing zone where Roman discipline reigned supreme. The Roman soldiers, trained to fight in close quarters, hacked and thrust their way through the enemy ranks with grim efficiency. It was less a battle and more a butcher's work, each Roman blade finding its mark with lethal precision. The chaos was palpable, a cacophony of clashing steel and desperate cries that filled the air as Boudica's forces found themselves ensnared in a trap of their own making. Despite their numerical advantage, Boudica's warriors were unable to break the Roman lines. The disciplined ranks of the legions held firm, their iron resolve as impenetrable as their armor. It was a harsh lesson in the power of organized military might, a sobering reminder that raw passion and fury, while potent, often fall short in the face of calculated strategy. As the battle wore on, the Romans began to push forward, their line inexorably advancing like a tide. Boudica's forces, squeezed by the narrowing gorge and the relentless Roman advance, began to falter. What had started as a fierce rebellion was now unraveling into a desperate struggle for survival. The field of battle, once a place of hope and defiance, became a grim tableau of defeat. In the aftermath, the casualties were staggering. Roman sources, never shy about embellishment, claimed that 80,000 Britons lay dead, a testament to the ferocity of the Roman counterattack. The Romans, by contrast, suffered minimal losses, their discipline and tactics carrying the day. It was a decisive and brutal victory, one that would echo through the ages as a cautionary tale of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. For Boudica, the defeat was catastrophic. The rebellion that had once seemed poised to shake the foundations of Roman rule in Britain was now a smoldering ruin, its leader a tragic figure in the annals of history. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Boudica, according to legend, took her own life to avoid capture, a romanticized end that fits neatly into the narrative of the warrior queen who would rather die than submit. And so, the Romans, ever the masters of spin, turned their victory into a lesson learned. Tacitus and his fellow historians cast the battle as a triumph of Roman civilization over barbarian chaos, a narrative that would reinforce Rome's image as the guardian of order and stability in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. For the Romans, the victory at Watling Street was more than just a battle. It was a reassertion of their dominance, a reminder that the reach of the empire was as unyielding as the Roman will. Yet, for all their triumph, the Romans knew better than to rest on their laurels. The rebellion, while crushed, had exposed vulnerabilities in their hold on Britain that could not be ignored. Suetonius, ever the pragmatist, set about fortifying Roman rule, reinforcing garrisons, and ensuring that the lessons of Boudica's uprising were not forgotten. The legions would remain vigilant, their eyes ever watchful for signs of dissent, their swords ever ready to quell the next flicker of rebellion. And so, the tale of Boudica and her rebellion comes to a close, leaving behind a legacy of defiance and determination that would resonate through the centuries. Her story, a blend of legend and harsh reality, serves as a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to be subjugated, who dare to stand against the might of an empire. In the end, Boudica's rebellion was more than just a fight against Roman rule. It was a struggle for identity, autonomy, and the right to shape one's own destiny. A fight that, while ultimately doomed, remains a powerful reminder of the enduring human will to resist. And so, what remains of Boudica after the dust of battle has settled and the Roman historians have had their say? Her story, a swirling cocktail of fact, myth, and a dash of historical hyperbole, leaves us with a legacy as complex as the woman herself. Boudica, in all her fiery glory, has become the poster child for resistance, a figure who stands tall in the annals of history as the embodiment of defiance. But let's peel back the layers and poke a stick at the romantic narratives to see what's really underneath. First up, the myths. Boudica is often painted as a larger-than-life warrior queen, her chariot wheels blazing, her hair a fiery torrent, and her spirit unyielding. It's a vision that captures the imagination, the kind of tale that makes you want to grab a sword and join the rebellion. But hold your chariots. There's a bit of theatrical license at play here. Much of what we know comes from Roman writers like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, who, let's be honest, went above a little creative storytelling. They were chroniclers with a flair for drama, painting Boudica as both fearsome and noble, a barbarian queen who dared to challenge Rome's supremacy. Their accounts are tantalizing, sure, but they're also steeped in the biases of a culture that saw the world through the lens of Roman superiority. So, was history kind to Boudica, or did it give her a makeover fit for an epic saga? That's the million denarius question. On one hand, she's celebrated as a symbol of strength and resistance, a rallying cry for those who fight against oppression. On the other, her portrayal is filtered through the victor's pen that might have exaggerated her ferocity to underscore the might of Rome's eventual triumph. It's a classic case of history being written by those who held the quill and the power. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, these embellishments, Boudica's story endures. She stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the fight for autonomy and identity is a battle worth waging. Her rebellion, while ultimately quashed, reverberates through the centuries as a symbol of courage and conviction, a David and Goliath tale for the ages. But let's not stop there. Boudica's legacy invites us to reflect on the role of women in history and how their stories are told. Too often, history books are dominated by the deeds of men, with women's contributions relegated to the footnotes. Boudica, however, refuses to be sidelined. She bursts onto the scene as a formidable leader, commanding armies and challenging an empire at a time when women were expected to be seen and not heard. Her story challenges us to reconsider the narratives we accept and the voices we amplify. In modern culture, Boudica has become more than just a historical figure. She's a cultural icon. She's been immortalized in statues, books, films, and even video games, where her indomitable spirit continues to inspire new generations. Her image has been co-opted for various causes, from feminism to nationalism, each seeking to draw strength from her legacy of defiance. It's a testament to her enduring appeal that, centuries later, her name still resonates as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. And let's not forget the economic context of her rebellion. Boudica's uprising wasn't just a battle cry against Roman brutality. It was also a desperate response to economic exploitation. The Romans, with their penchant for taxes that would make even the most hardened accountant blanch, turned financial oppression into an art form. The Iceni, like many other tribes, were pushed to the brink, their land and resources squeezed to fill Roman coffers. It's a story as old as time, the struggle for economic freedom, the fight against systems that seek to exploit and oppress. In examining Boudica's legacy, we also confront the harsh realities of empire. The Romans, for all their achievements in engineering and governance, were also architects of conquest and subjugation. Boudica's rebellion shines a spotlight on the cost of empire, the human toll of expansionist dreams that left cultures and communities in their wake. Her story is a reminder that the pages of history are stained with the struggles of those who dared to defy the status quo. In the end, Boudica's tale is a rich tapestry woven with threads of courage, tragedy, and myth. It's a story that invites us to question the narratives we inherit and to seek out the truths that lie beneath the surface. Her legacy is a call to remember the voices of those who stood against the tide, who fought for a future free from the shackles of domination. As we close the book on Boudica's story, we're left with more than just a chapter in history. We're left with a powerful narrative that continues to inspire and provoke. Her rebellion may have ended in defeat, but her spirit lives on, a testament to the enduring power of resistance and the unyielding desire for freedom. And so, as we bid farewell to Boudica, we carry forward her legacy, a reminder that the fight for justice and autonomy is one that echoes through the ages, undimmed and unforgotten.